Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show.
All along, Lin Li had never used the power of the debris of the stars from the time he started receiving guidance from Garesco's incarnation to the time he entered the barbarous arena to fight and train, because what he needed was to try to improve his own strength through various methods. Hence, he naturally could not rely on the power of external objects too often. However, Lin Li's strength could no longer be improved through such battles now. What he currently needed was the meditation land that Garesco had left behind, not fights with sanctuary-level prehistoric magical beasts. However, due to the fact that he had been deliberately refraining from using the debris of the stars, he almost somewhat ignored their existence. Now that Lin Li was facing the golden behemoth, whose defense he couldn't break at all despite using all his might, he finally recalled the 7 pieces of the debris of the stars that he had. In terms of sharp and powerful attacks, no magical weapon in Anro could compare to the 7 pieces of the debris of the stars. If there was one, it'd be the debris of the stars combined with the stars of fury. Unfortunately, Lin Li did not have the stars of fury, and only owned a crossbow of reincarnation that he had built with his own hands, and which had some of the characteristics of the stars of fury. Actually, apart from the stars of fury, the combination of the crossbow of reincarnation and the debris of the stars was probably the strongest in the entire Anro. After taking out the crossbow of reincarnation, the cold polar snow, burning hot, raging flames, violent thunderbolt, and nothingness appeared in his hand. They even changed into crossbow bolts that flickered with colorful light. While controlling the black and white solar spheres to keep the golden behemoth in midair, Lin Li loaded the debris of the stars into the crossbow one by one. As the debris of the stars pieces were loaded, the crossbow was also visibly changing as the dark golden mageths began glistening radiantly and emitting a massive and terrifying aura. It was as if the gods had descended into the world at this moment. Under the influence of this aura, the land and sky seemed to have changed in color, just as if they were frightened. The dark clouds rolling in the sky seemed to be reaching the ground, and a large amount of magical elements converged to form a terrifying storm. Releasing 4 pieces of the debris of the stars was not Lin Li's limit, but it was the limit of the crossbow of reincarnation. After all, it was only an imitation of the stars of fury. If he added another piece, the crossbow of reincarnation would probably collapse and disintegrate before the attack could be launched. At this moment, the golden behemoth, which was fixed in mid-air, also seemed to feel the threat from the aura of the debris of the stars. It roared and twisted its body desperately, as if it wanted to fall back to the ground as soon as possible. However, being in the sky, it did not have anything to leverage on, and could only contain a powerful force that it could not exert. If that blow of his turned out to be ineffective too, Lin Li would have no choice but to admit that the meditation land was not fated with him. While thinking about it, Lin Li pointed the crossbow of reincarnation at the golden behemoth that was fixed in mid-air. Lin Li himself was not too confident in this strike's effectiveness. After all, he didn't have the real stars of fury, and what he was holding was far from being able to exert the maximum power of the debris of the stars. Boom! Lin Li gently pulled the crossbow trigger, and with a crisp string sound, 4 intertwined rays of light shot out from the crossbow of reincarnation, striking the golden behemoth that was struggling in the air. That arrow caused the entire sky to lose its color, as if the only brilliance between the sky and the earth was that of the crossbow bolts. Arwoo! Sensing the great threat, the golden behemoth let out a groundbreaking roar, and the golden light that enveloped its entire body immediately intensified. It was even concentrated in the front, and was facing the shocking arrow, one that darted towards the sky. With the loud roar, the golden light scattered, and the light condensed by the 4 pieces of the debris of the stars blew away the golden light that had condensed into a giant shield and shot into the golden behemoth's body. The golden behemoth did not wail or cry, and was killed in an instant. The golden light that shrouded its body also surged into the golden behemoth's body as if it was frightened. Phew! Lin Li finally let out a long sigh of relief. Fortunately, the golden behemoth had gone berserk and leapt into the sky. Otherwise, even if the 4 pieces of the debris of the stars emerged at the same time, it might be difficult to break its defense. Sensing that the golden behemoth had died, Lin Li stopped the bombardment and flew close to the golden behemoth's corpse, taking it into the Ring of Endless Storms. Although Lin Li's Ring of Endless Storm contained a large amount of precious materials, and even the corpse of the Dragon of Destruction, the golden behemoth was, after all, very rare, and also had a useful function. Besides, Lin Li also wanted to study the mysterious ancient runes on it and find out how they gave the golden behemoth such an incredible defensive ability. The disappearance of golden behemoth's signs of vitality seemed to be a very huge warning to the other prehistoric magical beasts. Lin Li could completely feel through his mental strength that there were still some other prehistoric magical beasts watching at the edge of the battlefield, and all of them were now speeding up and leaving the place. On the other hand, the prehistoric magical beasts whose territories were near the battlefield also quickly moved as far away as possible at this moment. Indeed, with golden behemoths' unbelievably strong defense, even in such a world where the prehistoric magical beasts were everywhere, it was definitely an existence that stood at the top of the pyramid. Now that the prehistoric viper was dead, and so were the tempest beasts and the tough golden behemoth, they all knew that there had to be a terrifying existence there. After putting away the golden behemoth's corpse, Lin Li returned to the ground, but he did not immediately use the meditation land to restore his mana. Instead, he began to check the crossbow of reincarnation in his hand in bewilderment. Although the golden behemoth had been hovering in midair and could not leverage on the power from the earth, the power exerted by the crossbow of reincarnation and the 4 pieces of the debris of the stars was actually somewhat beyond his expectations. Lin Li had built the crossbow of reincarnation with his own hands, and thus he understood it very well. Hence, he was well aware what kind of power the crossbow of reincarnation could exert. After all, it was just a replica that imitated a very small part of the characteristics of the Stars of Fury. That was the reason for Lin Li's lack of confidence in the power of 4 pieces of the debris of the stars being launched together at the very beginning. If possible, he would have even launched all 7 pieces of the debris of the stars together. In his opinion, even if the combination of the replica and the 4 pieces of the debris of the stars could break through the defense of the golden behemoth, it wouldn't be easy, and they might only seriously injure the golden behemoth. However, in reality, the 4 pieces of the debris of the stars had blown away the defense of the mysterious ancient magic runes before penetrating the golden behemoth's body unhindered. Lin Li was obviously surprised. Although it was far inferior to the Stars of Fury, the performance of the crossbow of reincarnation had undoubtedly reached 1% of the power of the Stars of Fury, this time as compared to 0.1% previously. Although compared to the Stars of Fury, the replica was still far behind. It was akin to a direct 10-fold increase in performance of the crossbow of reincarnation this time. The 10-fold difference was manifested in the debris of the stars, which was absolutely terrifying. Lin Li carefully examined the crossbow of reincarnation and felt that the materials, mages, and arrays didn't seem to be any different from before. All of a sudden, he recalled when he'd first explored the Sky Castle and encountered the Stars of Fury that was condensed with mana in the last realm of the 7-realm spiral. At that time, Lin Li had also used the crossbow of reincarnation and 3 pieces of the debris of the stars to barely defeat the mana-condensed Stars of Fury. Lin Li remembered that, when he had been collecting the debris of the stars, Thunderbolt, a ball of something flew into the crossbow of reincarnation from the Stars of Fury replica that had been dispersed by a blow. It seemed that the increase in the performance of the crossbow of reincarnation was very likely because of the thing that had fused with the crossbow of reincarnation back then. Having understood that, Lin Li stopped dwelling on it. Anyway, the change in the crossbow of reincarnation brought no harm to him. In fact, it even allowed him to have an additional attacking method that was even stronger than others. The death of the prehistoric viper, the tempest beasts, and the golden behemoth made the area where Lin Li was located almost a forbidden place in the eyes of the other prehistoric magical beasts. Lin Li's purpose of visit was not to hunt the prehistoric magical beasts, so he naturally couldn't be bothered to attack them. Instead, he focused on enjoying the benefits this meditation land brought. However, deep down, Lin Li was still troubled by a question. Did Garesco implement all of those things in the inverted tower purely for the sake of giving him the power to deal with those space-time rifts in the near future? Although reality didn't seem to conflict with this assumption, Lin Li vaguely felt that Garesco's purpose did not seem to be as simple as that. Lin Li's hunch intensified when he reached the 3rd floor of the inverted tower and entered the meditation land. The current setup of these 3 levels, which included guidance, followed by battles to hone his skills, and lastly a meditation ground for the accumulation of mana, alone seemed to be a chain process that was orderly and systematic. Even Lin Li did not know what kind of situation he would be pushed into if he followed the steps. Of course, despite having such a huge doubt in mind, Lin Li wouldn't give up all this, at least not for the time being, as it seemed that Garesco's purpose for now was to help him improve as quickly as possible. As for what kind of problems he'd face after his strength was raised to a certain level, he would have to leave it for later. Lin Li stayed for almost a month in Garesco's meditation land, during which time he gained way more than what the average person would achieve in several years, or even more than a decade. Through a month of meditation, Lin Li's mana had accumulated to a rather terrifying degree. Although he was still stuck at the peak of level 27, his accumulation of pure mana was simply at the top of the sanctuary realm. Meanwhile, things could be considered peaceful in the breezy plains. It was as if the entry of the Gilded Kingdom did not result in any impact on the breezy plains. Of course, that was only what it seemed on the surface. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to call it an undercurrent. Actually, everyone knew that the breezy plains was about to change, so no matter how big or small the change might be, they were all secretly preparing for it. After entering the breezy plains, the Gilded Kingdom immediately began to swallow the various local forces in the breezy plains. Until now, no one knew how many forces of the breezy plains secretly supported the Gilded Kingdom. Hence, the various forces in the breezy plains were gradually divided into three portions. One portion of them chose to support the Gilded Kingdom, while another portion remained loyal to the Tower of Dusk, and the remaining portion were neutral fence-sitters, who were just waiting to see what happened so that they could go with the flow. After takeover and getting close to the local forces of the breezy plains, the development of the Gilded Kingdom in the breezy plains began to get on track. They successfully integrated into the breezy plains, allowing themselves to gain a considerable level of authority to speak in the breezy plains despite being a foreign force. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the development of the Gilded Kingdom should affect the Tower of Dusk the most. After all, before the Gilded Kingdom entered the breezy plains, the Tower of Dusk already had a dominant position in the region, and even forces like the Mithril Alliance and the others had already submitted to the Tower of Dusk. The appearance of the Gilded Kingdom and their actions during this period of time were almost considered a rebellion challenging the status of the Tower of Dusk. However, in the face of all the moves of the Gilded Kingdom, the Tower of Dusk had not reacted at all. They simply focused on managing their businesses, which confused the other forces of the breezy plains, as it didn't seem like the Tower of Dusk's usual style of handling things. They wondered if the Tower of Dusk was also afraid of the power of the Gilded Kingdom. Gavin, Basil, and other senior members of the Tower of Dusk were the only ones who knew that the so-called dominant ruling position was not of any practical use to the current Tower of Dusk. Previously, Lin Li wanted all the forces to submit to him, but it wasn't because he wanted anything from them, but rather because he wanted to ensure that the development of the Tower of Dusk would not be hindered by anything. No matter how the Gilded Kingdom developed and gained more authority, the Tower of Dusk would not bother with them as long as they did not touch their bottom line. It was just like adults letting children play freely as long as they didn't affect the adults. If they did, they would have to receive a beating. 1. Apparently 4 bolts turned into an arrow. In particular, the Tower of Dusk now had a sanctuary-level president, and the Sky Castle, which was the High Elves' most powerful war weapon. Such power was enough for them to be above all in the breezy plains. Unification would mean that they were all subjected to the same rule on the same level, but now the Tower of Dusk had a supreme position, just like the Ashen Warlock or the Supreme Council. Their status could not be shaken easily. However, with the arrival of a fleet from the Gilded Kingdom, the peace in the breezy plains was once again disrupted. According to the previous negotiations, the forces that the Gilded Kingdom could deploy in the breezy plains were subjected to strict limitations and regulations. What did the fleet's emergence mean then? After receiving the news, all the forces in the breezy plains, including those that had already pledged allegiance to the Gilded Kingdom, immediately became nervous. However, if the people of the Tower of Dusk did not stand up for the other forces, they wouldn't have enough courage to question the Gilded Kingdom. On the other hand, those who had pledged allegiance to the Gilded Kingdom did not manage to find out any substantial information from them based on hearsay. Hence, they thought of the Tower of Dusk and the various forces led by the Mithril Alliance and the Caesar family. They immediately sent their envoys to the Tower of Dusk, in hopes that the Tower of Dusk could pressure the Gilded Kingdom to clarify the issue of the fleet. Initially, these forces thought that the Tower of Dusk would definitely take this opportunity to extort a large sum of money from the Gilded Kingdom. After all, during the previous negotiations, the Tower of Dusk had angered the envoys of the Gilded Kingdom and taught them a lesson. However, they didn't expect the people of the Tower of Dusk to remain unmoved even after receiving this news. Everything was as per usual, and they were going on with their daily duties as usual. They did not seem to have any intention to question the Gilded Kingdom and blame them. Just like that, while the forces were nervously paying attention, the fleet that flew the flag of the Gilded Kingdom slowly sailed into the newly built Port Tim a few days later. The seabirds hovering over one of the battleships made the newly built seaport become lively again. Port Tim had originally been just a small fishing port. After the Gilded Kingdom officially entered the breezy plains, it naturally couldn't keep its battleships docked at the Manhwa family's port in Kalan City. Hence, they spent some money to purchase Port Tim and put it through expansion and development. Since the new harbor was built in accordance with the standards of military ports, the size of the current Port Tim could be considered the largest among the various ports in the breezy plains. Besides, when the fleet entered the harbor, the Gilded Kingdom placed the area around the harbor under martial law, driving away all the irrelevant people and spies from the various forces. Of course, doing so did not mean that they could completely eliminate the spies of the other forces. After all, the Gilded Kingdom's forces had only just entered the breezy plains. The martial law was actually for the sake of asserting dominance rather than establishing confidentiality. Clearly, Kantori and the others valued the fleet greatly. After the entire port was subjected to the martial law, Kantori, Elder Jory, and Admiral Nasri of the Third Fleet even brought their subordinates to the port and set up a grand scene to welcome the fleet's arrival. Although the spies of the various forces of the breezy plains were driven away from the harbor, they were tasked with finding a suitable position and keeping an eye on the situation from afar. When they saw what Kantori and the others had done, they were all stunned. Although they hadn't seen the situation of the fleet, they could already feel that something major was about to happen. Kantori and the senior executives of the Gilded Kingdom had already been investigated by the various forces of the breezy plains. Although they could not find any top-secret information, they had gained a thorough understanding of those several people. The members of the various forces knew that Kantori, Elder Jory, and Nasri were not only the leaders who were sent to the breezy plains by the Gilded Kingdom, they were also figures of respectable status even within the Gilded Kingdom. Kantori's identity as the son of the Chancellor of the Gilded Kingdom was not too significant. More importantly, he was a student of the priest of the Illuminati. That identity alone probably allowed him to be somewhat superior to the several other princes. On the other hand, the status of Elder Jory, who was an elder of the Illuminati, was not what any of the princes and ministers could compare to, even though he did not have a high ranking. The Admiral of the Third Fleet, Nasri, was a figure of extraordinary status in the Gilded Kingdom. The Gilded Kingdom itself was mainly focused on naval power, and the construction and development of the navy had always been their top priority. A strong navy could be considered the foundation of their nation. As he was an admiral, his status was obviously not inferior. Now, the three of them who were powerful figures of the Gilded Kingdom actually went to the port personally to meet the people from the fleet. Could it be that a powerful figure had arrived? All of a sudden, the spies began to tense up as their breathing quickened. That was definitely a piece of groundbreaking news. As long as they figured things out clearly, they would definitely be rewarded. A connection channel began to be built on the platform of the port for the battleships of the fleet. The people of the battleship were about to walk out, and the spies around the port began to get excited. They tried their best to think of a way to get closer to eavesdrop clearly. There were even some mages who launched the Warlock's eyes into the air in a bid to take advantage of its invisibility to explore the port from a close distance. Unfortunately, the Warlock's eyes could not escape the eye of powerful spell casters even though they could be hidden from ordinary people. As soon as the Warlock's eyes approached the sky above the port, several Illuminati priests who were following Elder Jory raised their hands into the air in unison, after which fireworks were set off in the sky, instantly sweeping away all the Warlock's eyes. Of course, that was not the only means that the spies had. For example, some could go into stealth mode, some could stay hidden in the shadows, and some could even share the vision of rats and other animals. However, although they had various means, their personal strength was not incredible, and they were incompetent compared to true powerhouses. When the port was cleared once again, the people on the battleship finally came out while Kantori and the others received them. Upon sight of the people who exited, the spies were once again shocked. They even felt engulfed by pangs of panic that made them find breathing difficult. Unlike what the spies had expected, those that came out of the battleship were not a few important figures, but a shockingly powerful army. Although there were probably less than 1,000 individuals in the army, each one of them had magical waves that were near the legendary level. There were even some powerhouses who had truly stepped into the legendary realm. Although the combat power of such a team was far inferior to the Magic Legion, under the lead of High Lord Osric, they were considered a terrifying force in the current Anral. Without the support of the Supreme Council and the Brilliant Shrine, the armies of the Felon Kingdom and Leaden Kingdom were probably no match for it. What does the Gilded Kingdom want? Is it really going to start a war? Although the mages of the various forces in the breezy plains had seen an improvement in strength under the influence of the magic tides over the past 2 years, no force would be able to contend with such a team. After the army got off the battleship, they immediately lined up neatly on the port, and finally a few important figures, who each had an extraordinary aura, walked out. At the same time, Kantori and others also took the initiative to welcome them without hesitation. After greeting each other, they slowly walked towards the city while talking about something. When peace was restored in the port, the spies of the various forces also finally sobered up from the shock. One by one, they scurried back to their respective forces and reported everything that they had just seen as soon as possible. Once the news got out, the entire breezy plains was immediately triggered by the news. The sudden addition of such a powerful force from the Gilded Kingdom was a great threat to any other force. Now, the leaders of the forces of the breezy plains could no longer stay calm. They were certain that the Gilded Kingdom was not in the breezy plains for a vacation. They had hoped that the Tower of Dusk would come forward and question Gilded Kingdom about the fleet, but now that they knew about the army, they felt even more threatened. Hence, those who had been sent to the Tower of Dusk were eagerly pestering Gavin and other senior executives of the Tower of Dusk, desperately hoping that the Tower of Dusk would stand up against the Gilded Kingdom. However, the members of the Tower of Dusk maintained the same attitude. In fact, even Gavin and other executives of the Tower of Dusk also suddenly went missing as they scurried to the Sky Castle's inverted tower to hide in peace. Although Gavin knew that the Gilded Kingdom suddenly dispatched a powerful army through those people, he also knew that the Gilded Kingdom would never pose a threat to the Tower of Dusk even if they had a stronger team. Actually, the attitude of the Tower of Dusk was very clear. As long as the Gilded Kingdom's actions were not in conflict with the interests of the Tower of Dusk, they would leave them be. Besides, during the initial negotiation, the forces of the Breezy Plains had all agreed to let the Gilded Kingdom enter the Breezy Plains. Since they had made that choice back then, they ought to be the ones to be responsible regardless of what problems they faced. In a state of helplessness, some of the forces led by the Mithril Alliance bit the bullet and began protesting against the Gilded Kingdom's actions, demanding an explanation for their army's deployment. However, the members of the Gilded Kingdom obviously did not take them seriously, especially now that there was such a powerful force sent from the Gilded Kingdom. Hence, they obviously were not bothered by the so-called top forces of the Breezy Plains. In order to exert pressure on the Gilded Kingdom, Elvis of the Mithril Alliance even rushed to Port Tim, together with 2 sanctuary powerhouses from other forces, in a bid to force the Gilded Kingdom to compromise under the power of the sanctuary powerhouses. However, while no one knew what the 3 sanctuary powerhouses had talked about with the people of Gilded Kingdom, they knew that they left Port Tim with sullen expressions soon after entering. Although Elvis and the others could only be considered pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses, they had still stepped into the sanctuary realm after all. Yet, the people of the Gilded Kingdom did not show them any respect. Apart from feeling shocked, they kept their guard up too. After Elvis and the others left Port Tim, they did not return to their respective forces immediately, and instead headed to the Tower of Dusk. Since they were ultimately still sanctuary powerhouses, Gavin could not ignore them like how he ignored others. He could only bring them to the guest hall, and then inform the president. However, the 3 pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses, who were unapproachable in the eyes of ordinary people, were nothing to Lin Li. Soon, Gavin returned to the meeting room alone, and told the 3 that Lin Li did not have the time to see them now. The president is already aware of your purpose of visit. He wants me to tell you that it's better for the people of the Breezy Plains to decide for the matters in the Breezy Plains. He doesn't have time to waste on these issues. Clearly, the Tower of Dusk was not going to get involved in this matter. Elvis and the others looked at each other. Despite being incredibly indignant, they had no choice but to get up and bid farewell. They knew very well that their identities as sanctuary powerhouses were just a joke to genuine sanctuary powerhouses. After they strayed far away from the Tower of Dusk, another sanctuary powerhouse who was from the Mithril Alliance finally complained to Elvis in displeasure. Elvis, it seems that our identities as sanctuary powerhouses carry no weight at all. Neither the Gilded Kingdom nor the Tower of Dusk takes us seriously. You've contacted the president of the Tower of Dusk before. What do you think he means by this? The person who spoke was a sanctuary powerhouse named Rejet, who was an elder of the Taylor family of the Mithril Alliance, and the grandfather of Joseph, the previous helmsman of the Mithril Alliance. He was initially stuck at the peak of level 24 and was waiting to die. To his surprise, he managed to break through the bottleneck with the help of the magic tides, and stepped into the sanctuary realm. When he stepped into the sanctuary realm, Rejet was still thinking about bringing the Taylor family to rise again, and he even wanted to lead the Taylor family to dominate the Breezy Plains, and establish a kingdom belonging to the Taylor family. However, after Rejet learned about the situation of the Breezy Plains and the distance between him and a real sanctuary powerhouse, he finally realized how ridiculous his thoughts were. Nonetheless, Rejet had stepped into the sanctuary realm, after all, and thus was feeling rather proud of himself. Hence, he was displeased with the Tower of Dusk's attitude. Hearing Rejet's words, Elvis laughed bitterly before helplessly saying, "You should have felt the powerful might of a sanctuary powerhouse, that came from the Sky Castle just now. That's not what we beginners in the Sanctuary Realm can compare to. No wonder they don't take us seriously. As for President Felix's attitude, I bet he just holds a grudge against us for our attitude during the negotiation. Indeed, the team sent by the Gilded Kingdom had caused a lot of trouble to the various forces of the Breezy Plains, and Lin Li was the one who helped them resolve the issues. However, when the Gilded Kingdom said that they wanted to negotiate for peace, the forces of the Breezy Plains immediately changed their attitude and thought of pitting the Gilded Kingdom against the Tower of Dusk so that they could reap some benefits. In the end, the forces ended up being frightened by every move of the Gilded Kingdom, while the Tower of Dusk remained completely unconcerned. He's also developing his force in the Breezy Plains. If the Gilded Kingdom really starts a war, there won't be benefit to them. Young people are still young after all. No matter how powerful he might be, his perspective of things still isn't comprehensive enough, Rajette said sourly, clearly green with envy and jealous of Lin Li for stepping into the Sanctuary Realm, so young and being even more competent than him. The Tower of Dusk is already invincible because they have the Sky Castle. They really don't have to worry about any action taken by the Gilded Kingdom, said Abrid, who was a sanctuary powerhouse from the Caesar family, and had stepped into the Sanctuary Realm when his lifespan was nearing its end just like Rajette. The two of them used to be rivals in love, but after more than 1,000 years, their conflict was gradually resolved. Although his tone was full of envy and jealousy too, Abrid was jealous of the Tower of Dusk for having the Sky Castle. If the Caesar family also had a Sky Castle like theirs, they would have probably long ruled over the Breezy Plains and established a powerful kingdom that could contend with the Felon Kingdom and Leaden Kingdom. Hearing their bitter complaints, Elvis shook his head helplessly. Although the three of them were old, Rajette and Abrid were actually 2 generations older than Elvis. Hence, Elvis was in no place to criticize the two of them at this moment. He had no choice but to change the subject. Although the Gilded Kingdom's actions do not pose a threat to the Tower of Dusk, it's not the same for us. We don't have the Sky Castle. I think we'd better go back as soon as possible and talk with the leaders of other forces to come up with some countermeasures for this matter. Elvis' words pulled Rajette and Abrid back to reality as the two of them looked at the Tower of Dusk unanimously. After secretly sighing, they followed Elvis back to the headquarters of the Mithril Alliance helplessly. On the Tower of Dusk's side, Gavin returned to Lin Li's side again after sending the three away. Gavin wasn't too worried about the Gilded Kingdom. The Tower of Dusk was now helmed by a real sanctuary powerhouse, while the mages under him were also becoming increasingly stronger. As long as the people of the Gilded Kingdom did not go crazy, they definitely wouldn't provoke the Tower of Dusk casually. However, the Gilded Kingdom did not show any respect to Elvis and the other 2 sanctuary powerhouses at all, which really surprised Elvis. After all, pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses were still in the sanctuary realm. Although they could not compare to actual sanctuary powerhouses, they were still far stronger than those who were at the peak of the legendary realm. The Gilded Kingdom's base camp was far away, so what gave them the confidence to disregard them? Could it be because of the fleet just now? President, the 3 of them have already left. I can tell that they've been angered by the Gilded Kingdom. It's surprising that they didn't flare up immediately. Gavin was not gloating, but rather was displeased with the two-faced factions. Of course, if he looked at it from a different perspective, there was no reason for them not to do that. Who wouldn't spare a thought for their own interests? In this world of survival of the fittest, especially in the chaotic Breezy Plains, anyone who still stood firm to those moral examples would definitely be defeated. However, despite understanding their rationale, no one would be willing to be betrayed by others. This time, the Tower of Dusk was not betrayed, but the forces definitely didn't have any good intentions for allowing the Gilded Kingdom to come over. Gavin was well aware of that. Of course they have to tolerate it. They might have entered the sanctuary realm, but they're only a half-finished product when compared to real sanctuary powerhouses, Lin Li said calmly. In front of ordinary people, pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses were sanctuary powerhouses, but to the genuine sanctuary powerhouses, they were no different from insignificant nobodies. Gavin originally wanted to nod and agree, but his expression suddenly changed, and he looked at Lin Li in shock. President, do you mean that they've met a real sanctuary powerhouse? Is there really a true sanctuary powerhouse in the Gilded Kingdom's team this time? That was definitely a shocking piece of news. If the Gilded Kingdom had sent a true sanctuary powerhouse, then what exactly was the purpose of their operation this time? Had they really lost their minds and were thinking of attacking the Tower of Dusk? Why else do you think they'd come here? Lin Li nodded a little, but there wasn't any special expression on his face. Clearly, the sanctuary powerhouse of the Gilded Kingdom did not make him feel threatened at all. In fact, just before that fleet from the Gilded Kingdom entered the port, Lin Li had already detected the aura of the sanctuary powerhouse that shrouded that fleet. The aura had nothing to do with magical waves, and was instead a type of influence on the world laws. Only those who had truly stepped into the sanctuary realm could capture the special aura of the sanctuary powerhouses from the changes in the world laws. Like Elvis and the other 3 pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses, those who did not reach the sanctuary realm, in terms of their mastery of the world laws, would not be able to sense the presence of a sanctuary powerhouse. Through the changes in the world laws, they still had to rely on their detection of magical waves to gauge the strength of others. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone to the Gilded Kingdom to find trouble. No matter what, there still weren't any actions taken by the Tower of Dusk, and it was as if everything that happened in the breezy plains had nothing to do with them. In a few days' time, the Mithril Alliance managed to gather the leaders of several forces, and they planned to form another large alliance to prevent the Gilded Kingdom from harming them. In the past, the alliance of the forces of the breezy plains had managed to withstand the invasion of the Leaden Kingdom, and force the Felon Kingdom to the point where they had completely no means to rule over the breezy plains. Although it was partly because of the power struggle between the 2 kingdoms, one could not deny that the power of these forces in the breezy plains also played a fairly important role. Hence, whenever they were facing the pressure of powerful external forces, the first thing that the local forces thought would be to unite. For example, during the rise of the Tower of Dusk previously, the forces of breezy plains felt threatened, so there was a suppression carried out on the Tower of Dusk which involved almost all the forces in the breezy plains. However, while the Tower of Dusk posed a threat to some forces, it also gave them a lot of benefits. The boycott failed only because of the Ashen Warlock's words. Otherwise, even if the Tower of Dusk had not been destroyed, their speed of development would have definitely been greatly reduced. This time, in the face of the threat of the Gilded Kingdom, the Tower of Dusk's nonchalance left the Mithril Alliance and other forces with no choice but to rely on themselves. Hence, under the lead of the Mithril Alliance, the various forces naturally formed an alliance. Of course, after forming the alliance, they did not immediately go to deal with the Gilded Kingdom. After all, they had yet to figure out the true intentions of the Gilded Kingdom. For the sake of protecting their interests, no one was willing to start a war lightly, unless it was their last resort. Hence, the first thing that the Alliance did was to send a warning to the Gilded Kingdom, in the name of the Alliance, asking them to explain the purpose behind the arrival of their army, and to withdraw it from the breezy plains, as soon as possible to avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. Unfortunately, the warning they sent had no effect at all, as the Gilded Kingdom did not send any reply. The Gilded Kingdom seemed to have completely ignored their existence as an alliance, and was still carrying out their unfathomable preparations in an orderly manner. However, the forces did not dwell on it for long. Soon, the Gilded Kingdom took action again. The group, which was greatly feared by many forces of the breezy plains, did not show intentions of advancing inland towards the breezy plains. Instead, it traveled south along the coastline of the breezy plains after leaving Port Tim. The movements of the Gilded Kingdom's team were immediately reported to the forces of the Mithril Alliance and other factions. They naturally discussed and speculated about the true intentions of the team again. The forces whose influence was in the mainland were naturally secretly relieved at this moment, as that at least showed that the Gilded Kingdom did not have the intention to develop inland for now. However, there were still some forces that were in the south of the breezy plains, on the course of the Gilded Kingdom's advancement. After hearing the news, those forces immediately tensed up. They wondered, could it be that the Gilded Kingdom wants to occupy more port cities? Or are they coveting the minerals along the coastline for the convenience of transportation? Now, the alliance seemed to have become divided soon after its establishment. The inland forces naturally felt that the matter had nothing to do with them, so they decided to continue being fence-sitters and watch what the Gilded Kingdom was planning to do next. However, the factions in the south could not calm down at all. After all, in their opinion, they had already been directly threatened. Hence, they suggested that the alliance immediately exert pressure on the Gilded Kingdom. In fact, a division was the scariest thing for an alliance with a dynamic like theirs. After all, there wasn't anyone who could really hold down all the forces. If the Gilded Kingdom directly attacked with a large army and made clear their intentions to encroach on the entire breezy plains, those forces would definitely see the Gilded Kingdom as the common enemy and go all out to defend against the foreign enemy, just like when they had resisted the invasion of the Leaden Kingdom. However, once there was a conflict of internal interests, the effectiveness of the alliance would be limited. Be it intentionally or not, the Gilded Kingdom's actions had immediately split the alliance of the breezy plains, forming a clear divide between the coastal and inland forces. They kept arguing during the discussions, but the coastal forces were still the minority. After all, despite the squabbles, they did not fall out. Of course, while arguing, They were also keeping their eyes fixed on the terrifying army of the Gilded Kingdom along the sea. A large number of scouts were following the Gilded Kingdom's group, and they would report to the leaders of the various forces of the Alliance almost once every 2 or 3 hours. In the meeting room of the Alliance, a huge map of the breezy plains was hung up. Whenever there was a new report about the Gilded Kingdom's actions, the leaders in the Alliance would immediately identify the corresponding location on the map, hoping to determine the true agenda of the Gilded Kingdom through such a method. When the coastal forces saw that the Gilded Kingdom's team was getting closer and closer to their range of influence, they got even more nervous. But they did not clamor about returning immediately like the rest. Threatening to split up was just a strategy. If the Gilded Kingdom really took action on their forces, going back now would be akin to suicide. Although it was true that their forces, which they had painstakingly built, would likely be wiped out by the Gilded Kingdom, and that would bring about a huge heartache, it was better than dying. Of course, that did not mean that they had really gotten over it. While waiting for the final verdict, they were still trying to convince the people around them, in hopes that they could send teams to support their own forces. They even took out their precious treasures without hesitation, and promised to give the other forces a portion of their resources, while constantly emphasizing about how ruthless, immoral, and greedy the Gilded Kingdom was. In particular, Isekaied, the patriarch of the Karsha family, that lived on the coast of the breezy plains, and was second only to the Manhwa family in terms of strength, was going all out at this moment. He even announced that he was willing to offer half of the family's resources, in exchange for the support of various forces, the reason being that the Karsha family would be the first force to be attacked by the Gilded Kingdom according to the constant reports. Most importantly, the Gilded Kingdom had once sent people to talk to the Karsha family, in a bid to get them to give up one of the magical metal mines that they had. However, as usual, the miserly people of the Gilded Kingdom offered an extremely low price, and the deal eventually fell through. Hence, in Sandev's opinion, the Gilded Kingdom had to have sent that army to target the Karsha family. They probably would take away everything belonging to the Karsha family and even annihilate them. Compared to the Manhwa family, the Karsha family was slightly inferior, and there were even very few legendary powerhouses. They could not withstand the attacks of the Gilded Kingdom at all. However, despite Sandev's painstaking efforts to plead with them, only the leaders of a few neighboring forces of the Karsha family helped to speak up for them, while the rest remained unmoved. Actually, others could not be blamed for being selfish. After all, the Gilded Kingdom's army was simply too powerful. They had more than 1,000 powerhouses that were above level 15 and dozens of legendary powerhouses. That level of power was not something that ordinary forces could contend with. Besides, Elvis had yet to tell them that there were sanctuary powerhouses in the Gilded Kingdom's army. If news about it were to get out, the alliance would probably collapse. At this moment, the sounds of footsteps shuffling quickly could be heard coming from outside the door. Everyone in the conference hall had already gotten used to hearing it because they would hear it once every 2 or 3 hours. They knew about it because they had received some news beforehand, and thus all of them fell silent. As expected, a mage of the Mithril Alliance hurried in from outside, holding a crumpled note in hand. He walked to the leader of the alliance, Elvis. After getting the note, Elvis glanced at Sandev, but the latter crumpled onto the chair before he even asked about the content of the note. Judging from the progress of the Gilded Kingdom's army, and the direction of their advancement, they could tell that they had to have already been standing on top of the ruins of the Karsha family. Thinking of this, Sandev seemed to have lost all his energy as he muttered with a look of dejection, "Is it over? Is the Karsha family going to be ruined under me?" However, after taking a look at Sandev, Elvis remained silent, and frowned a little with a look of puzzlement. All West CHPT or S on an O, VLIN, CM. When he saw Elvis' expression, a Brit from the Caesar family couldn't help but ask in puzzlement, "Elvis, what exactly were you told? Did the Gilded Kingdom's army do something to the Karsha family?" "That's what I've been puzzled about," Elvis said with a confused smile. He did not say anything further, and handed the note to Abrid. After Abrid took a look at the note, he looked just as confused as Elvis was. How can it be? Could those kids have made a mistake? Their conversation immediately aroused the curiosity of the people below as they eagerly wanted to see what information it was that made Elvis and Abrid look so puzzled. On the other hand, Rajet of the Taylor family immediately exclaimed, "What are you two doing? There are so many people waiting here. What exactly is written on that note?" Abrid shook his head and passed the note back to Rajet while Elvis said to everyone, "According to the information that we've just received, the Gilded Kingdom's army did not enter the area where the Karsha family is located. Instead, they're on the road that leads to this place." After saying that, he pointed at a spot on the map with his rod. "What, are the people of the Gilded Kingdom fools? Or do they not know the way at all? Why would they go to the Blackwater Swamp? Haha. The people of the Gilded Kingdom are in for trouble this time. The Blackwater Swamp is a place of death. Even sanctuary powerhouses do not dare to easily set foot in." If half of the Gilded Kingdom's army can come out alive this time, they have to thank the gods for blessing them. Seeing the location pointed out by Elvis on the map, the people in the conference hall immediately got into a commotion as the leaders of the various forces clapped and rejoiced. It seemed that they could already see how the Gilded Kingdom's army would bleed in the Blackwater Swamp and leave with heavy losses. As people of the breezy plains, how could they not know about the Blackwater Swamp? It was the most famous place of death in the entire breezy plains. In the Blackwater Swamp, there was an abundance of miasma, poisonous swamps, and poisonous gases. The poisonous magical beasts were not the most terrifying ones. The poisonous bugs were what was truly deadly. Unique to the Blackwater Swamp, the poisonous bugs might have a simple name of Blackwater poisonous bugs, but their power was definitely not simple. Firstly, they contained deadly poison, and the toxins of the Blackwater poisonous bugs contained a blend of death, filth, corrosion, curse, and other characteristics. Even a worm would not last more than 3 minutes after being bitten by one of them. Of course, when it came to bugs, the first thing that many would think of doing would be to burn them with fire. In fact, that was what most of them did too. As long as there was a mage who could cast fire magic spells, the team would probably not be in any danger. However, the Blackwater poisonous bugs were different from other bugs, as they were not afraid of flames at all. In fact, they would even be able to devour the flame energy in the fire, which was the reason that no one had tried to burn the Blackwater poisonous bugs with fire. More importantly, the Blackwater poisonous bugs were not only fearless towards fire, they were also immune to all kinds of magical damage. It would be easy to kill the Blackwater poisonous bugs, as one would just have to slap them hard and turn them into mud. However, if there were more than 1 million poisonous bugs, even 1,000 hands would not be enough. Besides, as long as one got bitten by a bug, there would be no other outcome apart from death. No one knew how many Blackwater poisonous bugs there were in the Blackwater Swamp. They only knew that black fog often rose in the swamp, and it was caused by the Blackwater poisonous bugs. Anyone who entered the Blackwater Swamp would not be able to guard against it at all, as they would inhale a few Blackwater poisonous bugs with every breath they took. They would not be able to come out alive at all. Fortunately, the vicious poisonous bugs completely could not leave the Blackwater Swamp. Otherwise, all the living beings of Anril would be annihilated. That was the reason that the forces of the breezy plains were no longer worried. Even though the Gilded Kingdom was incredibly powerful and could dominate the breezy plains, they didn't believe that anyone would be able to walk out of the Blackwater Swamp alive. I didn't expect that terrifying place would actually help us so much this time. The people in the conference hall each had a relaxed smile on their face. They were waiting to hear the footsteps again, and the good news that would come with it. Everything's fine now. Haha. That bunch of bastards actually went the wrong way. They must be out of luck. Sandev, who was already desperate, immediately perked up as he could not stop smiling at all. However, Elvis and others did not seem too happy at this moment. Instead, they were frowning, and the bewilderment on their faces was getting even more obvious. They didn't think that the people of the Gilded Kingdom would make such a low-level mistake. Even though the Gilded Kingdom was an external force, there was no way that they wouldn't know about what happened in the Blackwater Swamp. Hence, the people of the Gilded Kingdom did not really go the wrong way, and they were simply heading for the Blackwater Swamp instead. That seemed to be a possibility, but it confused Elvis further. The Blackwater Swamp was the deadliest place in the breezy plains, but unlike some other dangerous and forbidden areas, the Blackwater Swamp had basically nothing of value, because everyone knew that the Blackwater poisonous bugs enjoyed devouring mana, and thus anything of some value would have been devoured by the Blackwater poisonous bugs. If there was anything valuable in the Blackwater Swamp, it would probably be the infinite amount of Blackwater poisonous bugs. After all, their toxins were of some value to pharmacists. However, did the Gilded Kingdom go to such great lengths just for the sake of catching a few bugs? That explanation obviously did not make sense. Elvis and others did not voice their doubts, but everyone in the conference hall almost popped champagne to rejoice immediately. If they thought carefully, they would naturally be able to find what was amiss. However, they had been too stressed out by the matter of the Gilded Kingdom, and were more willing to believe that things were in their favor. Besides, in their opinion, regardless of whether the Gilded Kingdom's army had taken the wrong path or not, it was a matter of fact that they had entered the Blackwater Swamp. Given the horrors of the Blackwater Swamp, it would be impossible to get out of it in one piece no matter what the agenda of the Gilded Kingdom's army was. Hence, there was no need to consider what the Gilded Kingdom was getting up to this time. After an hour since the news was spread, the sound of footsteps outside the conference hall began to ring again, causing everyone in the hall to fall silent. The fact that the news had come so quickly made the people in the conference hall more confident about the conjecture in their hearts. Therefore, each one of them craned their necks to look at the door, waiting to hear about the losses of the Gilded Kingdom's team. As expected, the figure of the mage who delivered the news soon reappeared in front of the door of the conference hall, holding a note in his hand as well. However, the mage ignored the crowd who was full of anticipation, and instead quickly walked towards Elvis with a look of astonishment on his face. The crowd did not care much about the mage's expression, and they simply thought that he was horrified by the Blackwater swamp. All their eyes were on the note in the mage's hand as they stared at it, until it reached Elvis' hand. However, what made them feel confused was the fact that Elvis merely took a glance at the note without immediately announcing any exciting good news to them. Instead, his face was instantly full of disbelief, just like that of the mage who had delivered the news. A few of them couldn't help but ask Elvis, "Master Elvis, what is the news about? Has the Gilded Kingdom's army been annihilated?" "No, it's the Blackwater swamp." Elvis shook his head and took a deep breath, before saying with a grave expression, "From today onwards, there will no longer be a place called Blackwater Swamp in the breezy plains." After Elvis said that, the people in the entire conference hall immediately got into an uproar as they dared not believe their ears at all. Some even forgot Elvis' identity, and repeatedly asked him if he had read wrongly, or if there was a mistake in the relay of the message. Elvis did not explain much, and simply passed the note around. In the end, almost every person who saw the contents of the note immediately became dumbfounded as they fell back into their chairs, and muttered incessantly about how it was impossible. At this moment, the scouts who had just relayed the news finally stood on the ground of the breezy plains, after the Gilded Kingdom's army left. Actually, it could no longer be called the Blackwater Swamp, which no one had stepped into for thousands of years, as it had already become history. At this moment, the black fog that emitted the aura of death and erosion had become completely different in appearance. The black fog had already dissipated, and was replaced by a salty odor, as if it was just the seaside. The decayed trees and various swamp plants in the surroundings were scattered all over the ground, covered in a thick shell of salt, as if they had been carved in crystal. The ground that would have sunk deeper when stepped on was now covered with a hard layer of salt. Even a weapon would not leave an obvious trace in the ground. Is this the Blackwater Swamp that was once known as the deadliest land of the breezy plains? The scouts looked at their surroundings in disbelief, unable to imagine what kind of power could actually reduce the Blackwater Swamp to such a state. "This is the power of the gods," a scout exclaimed in astonishment and horror, as if he had become deranged because of the changes. However, none of their peers dared to mock his seemingly crazy words. Instead, they seemed to agree, and they recalled the shocking scene that they had seen previously. Shortly after the Gilded Kingdom's army entered the Blackwater Swamp, boundless seawater suddenly surged out of nowhere, and flooded the entire Blackwater Swamp. By the time the water subsided, the Blackwater Swamp turned into its current state. Such a drastic change was obviously done by something with the power of the gods. "Wait, where did the army from the Gilded Kingdom go?" asked a scout, who finally remembered what he had to do after being amazed. Although the entire Blackwater Swamp had turned into a world of salt, the scouts were best at tracking, and the army from the Gilded Kingdom was not small, either, and did not deliberately try to hide its tracks. Thus, the scouts soon managed to track down the Gilded Kingdom's army, and carefully followed it while continuing to send new information to the Alliance. In the conference hall of the Alliance, everyone finally stopped doubting the change of the Blackwater Swamp after receiving several messages in a row. However, their festive emotions were replaced by immense fear and horror. The power of the Gilded Kingdom was completely beyond their imagination. Although they did not see the shocking transformation of the Blackwater Swamp with their own eyes, they could tell how terrifying the Gilded Kingdom was from the news that was constantly sent to them. Some of them even began to doubt whether the power of this alliance was really enough for them to contend with the Gilded Kingdom. However, Elvis and the other three sanctuary powerhouses knew that the change of the Blackwater Swamp was very likely to be the doing of the sanctuary powerhouse of the Gilded Kingdom. While making them feel horrified, it also made them feel somewhat grateful that they hadn't lost their temper at Port Tim back then. Otherwise, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Seeing that Evrion's heart began to waver, Elvis was feeling just as helpless. That was the problem with an alliance like theirs. Unless their survival was in danger, they would all flock towards benefits and vie with each other for them. Whenever there was trouble, they would flee as fast as possible. Since the Gilded Kingdom has no intentions of attacking us, we'd better do what we're supposed to, and stop wasting time here. After confirming that his family had escaped an ordeal, Sandev recalled the fact that he had been rejected by the other forces when he asked for help just now. Sandev had lost his faith in such an alliance, and he felt that it would be better to simply go back and talk to the Gilded Kingdom about the mine. Although they would definitely lose some benefits, they would at least be able to take the opportunity to cozy up the Gilded Kingdom, which was at least better than wasting time here. Elvis naturally wouldn't let Sandev go just like that. He knew that there were definitely many people in the conference hall who shared the same thoughts as Sandev. If Sandev took the initiative to pull out, half the people in the conference hall would leave. Fortunately, after Elvis' persuasion, coupled with the fact that Sandev did not want to fall out with the Mithril Alliance, they finally managed to make them stay. Since the Karsha family was not the target of the Gilded Kingdom, and the Blackwater Swamp has been reduced to such a state, what is the real agenda of the Gilded Kingdom's army? Elvis looked at the crowd whose minds were obviously somewhere else below. He had no choice but to turn to look at Abrid and Rajet, whom he started discussing the topic with. As for the others, he decided to leave them be as long as they didn't ask to leave. According to the latest intelligence, the team seems to be advancing towards the Leviton Canyon after passing through the Blackwater Swamp. Could it be that they found some precious resources there that we don't know about? Is that why they're creating such a scene to occupy it first? Abrid said in bewilderment as he stared at the map. Leviton Canyon, that's the... Rajet was just about to say how dangerous the Leviton Canyon was, but he immediately thought of the shocking change of the Blackwater Swamp, and was suddenly unable to finish his sentence. Resources that we don't know about. That's not impossible. After all, the people of the Gilded Kingdom and the Illuminati had also moved from land to overseas. They might have passed some information down and recorded some things we do not know. Elvis knew that when the Illuminati had been developing on land, they had been even more powerful than the Tower of Dusk during their prime. It was not surprising if such a power had passed down some unknown information. Of course, if the Gilded Kingdom's army just wanted to find some resources, Elvis and the others would be relieved. Anyway, even if they knew some precious information, they would have no means of obtaining the items. In the Leviton Canyon, there lived demons named Leviton which were rumored to have originated from the bottom of the abyss. Strictly speaking, Leviton demons were not extremely powerful, and they were at most at the legendary realm. Most of them were near the legendary level, and only a few could have legendary level power. However, the Leviton demons had immortal bodies, and even the most powerful demons would have no means to do anything to them. Hence, they could live comfortably at the bottom of the abyss, no matter what means were used, and regardless of whether they were beheaded, cut into pieces, or burned with fire, they would not die. Even the power of purification of the holy light magic would only result in a pseudo-death, and the Levitons would revive after being left alone. In addition, Leviton demons also had the ability to shape-shift and produce clones at will, though there would not be much of an increase in strength. However, they could still spell trouble. Due to the fact that the replication was comprehensive, even their memories would be fully intact with no discrepancies at all. The mana would remain the same, just like the habits, so much that it would be difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. The Leviton demons in the Leviton Canyon had scurried out of the canyon at some time, but anyway, everyone knew that there should be a group of Levitons at the bottom of the abyss, thus giving rise to the name Leviton Canyon. Perhaps it is the treasure hidden there before the Illuminati left the continent. Isn't it true that no one has been able to figure out the origin of those Leviton demons? Rajet suddenly asked, making a far-fetched conjecture. He thought that those Levitons from the bottom of the abyss had probably been released by the Illuminati back then, all for the sake of guarding the treasures that had been stored when the Illuminati left. Upon hearing about a precious treasure and resources, those in the conference hall, who had originally intended to stir some trouble, immediately perked up. Some said that the resources belonged to all the people of the breezy plains, and could not be snatched by the Gilded Kingdom. Some said that the treasure had to have been scavenged by the Illuminati, so the Illuminati ought to return it to them, and so on. At this moment, the army of the Gilded Kingdom, which was the focus of debate among the factions, had already entered the Leviton Canyon without hesitation, as if they didn't know the horrors of the Leviton Canyon. Perhaps they knew about them, but didn't take them to heart. In terms of scale, the Leviton Canyon might seem really ordinary and annual, and was far from comparable to the Gargus Canyon in the north. In general, the Leviton Canyon seemed narrow and deep, so much so that sunlight couldn't reach its bottom. Hence, it was very dim in the canyon, adding to its eeriness. The people of the Gilded Kingdom got into a long snake-like line that seemed to wind through the canyon before disappearing into its depths. The spies of the Alliance, however, had to stop at the entrance of the canyon. To them, the Leviton Canyon was no less dangerous than the Blackwater Swamp. Do we follow them in, or should we wait a little longer to see what happens? Nothing was as important as their own lives. After taking a look at the deep, dark, and gloomy canyon, the scouts decided to wait a little longer to see what happened. Although the Gilded Kingdom was leading the way, no one dared to guarantee that they would not leave one or two Leviton demons behind. Moreover, they might just get driven out by the Levitons soon after they entered. Or perhaps, like with the Blackwater Swamp, the Leviton Canyon might be flooded with salt because of the people of the Gilded Kingdom. The group of scouts crouched at the mouth of the canyon, keeping their guard up in case of any movement around them. while the two mages in the middle each cast the warlock's eyes, which flew into the canyon. Having been with the team for so long, they knew that as long as they didn't go overboard, and did not disturb the people of the Gilded Kingdom, the latter wouldn't waste time to deal with them. Hence, they simply used the warlock's eyes to observe from afar. It wouldn't matter even if they were discovered. The two warlock's eyes flew into the canyon, wobbling and following the traces left by the expedition from the Gilded Kingdom, under the manipulation of the two mages. When they flew to a distance that was the limit of the mages, the warlock's eyes finally transmitted the scene in the canyon that was incredibly shocking to them. The Gilded Kingdom's army finally faced the Levidans of the canyon. On the opposite side of the Gilded Kingdom's army, there were numerous Levidans, which probably amounted to close to 10,000. Although the Levidans did not have incredible strength, that was in comparison with the abyssal demons at the bottom. In fact, the worst of the Levidans were around level 15, and there were hundreds of legendary level 1s. With such a huge number and incredible power, the Levidans would be a huge disaster for the breezy plains. The two mages who saw that scene through the warlock's eyes suddenly had a strange thought in their hearts. At this moment, the army of the Gilded Kingdom abruptly moved. In the face of the huge number of Levidans, the warriors of the Gilded Kingdom waved their weapons in their hands, and each one of them emanated navy blue combat energy as they killed the Levidans fearlessly. The entire battlefield was instantly in an uproar as the Levidan demons roared ferociously and the warriors yelled, the sounds of magic spells intertwining and reverberating in the deep canyon. Despite knowing that the Levidans had immortal bodies, the mages who observed the battlefield through the warlock's eyes realized that the Gilded Kingdom had used some means to cause great damage to Levidans. In this battle, the Levidans lost the immortality of their bodies as they were split open and blown apart easily. Black blood splattered everywhere, dyeing the canyon black. Without their immortal bodies, the Levidans were like hedgehogs without spikes and tigers with their claws cut off. They could be considered to have lost their most powerful weapon. Moreover, even with the immortal bodies, their own defense was pathetic, and the removal of their immortality was akin to getting rid of all their defenses. The battle, which lasted just under an hour, ended with tens of thousands of Levidans being slaughtered by the Gilded Kingdom's army, and the battlefield seemed to have turned into the same state as the Blackwater Swamp as the rock walls were covered in black blood, while the ground was covered in the Levidans' limbs. The people of the Gilded Kingdom who were involved did not seem to have any reaction to it. Through the warlock's eyes, the mages that had been observing the battle situation began throwing their guts up. Although they had gotten used to witnessing death as people of the breezy plains, it was their first time witnessing such a tragic scene. Those Levidan corpses turned into black mud in no time, which made it seem even more disgusting. After the battle ended, the people of the Gilded Kingdom did not take any extra action. They simply stepped on the Levidan corpses indifferently, producing nauseous sounds that would be made when mud was stepped on. They continued to advance with no expression. At this moment, the scouts had also found out about everything in the canyon through the mage's description. After being shocked, they finally remembered their duties, immediately wrote down all the information they had obtained, and sent it back to the Alliance using the tamed Flash Sparrow. However, after sending the information, the scouts were stuck in a dilemma again, and they could not decide if they should risk following the army into the canyon again. Although the Gilded Kingdom's group had already exterminated tens of thousands of Levidans, no one knew if there were still any left in the canyon. The Gilded Kingdom might have dealt with the Levidan demons easily, but the scouts of the Alliance were clear of their own abilities. Although they had a lot of people, they would end up being tortured as long as one Levidan rushed into their group. However, after hesitating for a long time, they had no choice but to bite the bullet and carefully enter the Levidan Canyon. After all, it was their duty, and they had many other peers who were from other forces. Besides, no one knew if there were any guardians inside, and they could not bluff their way through at all. The Alliance had sent so many scouts because the Gilded Kingdom's team, which they had to keep an eye on, was just too strong, and they were worried that they would be perfunctory in their actions during the critical moment. Clearly, their approach worked. Soon after, the scouts entered the canyon with fear. The mage in the Mithril Alliance headquarters in the Breezy Plains, who were responsible for delivering the news, also entered the conference hall, again with the latest piece of news. Tens of thousands of Levidans have been destroyed. There is not a single casualty from the Gilded Kingdom. After hearing this news, everyone in the conference hall was astonished and dumbfounded as their faces froze. They could not believe it at all. Weren't the Levidans known to have immortal bodies? Even without their immortal bodies, they were still large in number. There were tens of thousands of Levidans, and they could not be crushed and killed easily like ants. The most unacceptable thing was that the Gilded Kingdom's army did not suffer a single casualty, which didn't make any sense at all. Were the Levidan demons incapable of resisting, and simply waited obediently to be killed? Everyone was dumbfounded by the news, and they only gradually recovered from the shock after a long time. At the same time, they also realized how terrifying the Gilded Kingdom's army was. They definitely didn't think that the Levitans were incapable of resistance, and simply waited to be killed. That could only prove that the strength of the Gilded Kingdom was too horrifying, so much so that the Levitans could not retaliate even if they wanted to. Thinking about this, all the people present felt that a chill rising in their hearts uncontrollably. Each one of them couldn't help but ask themselves if their alliance would be strong enough for them to contend with the Gilded Kingdom's group. What exactly is the Gilded Kingdom trying to do? Elvis looked at the people below, and he could tell what they were thinking from the looks on their faces. However, even Elvis, who was a sanctuary powerhouse, didn't think that his alliance would be able to contend with the Gilded Kingdom, let alone the others. Could it be that the Gilded Kingdom was just trying to assert their dominance and prove it to the forces in the breezy plains? Regardless of whether it was intentional or unintentional, that action did cause the forces of the breezy plains to be extremely astonished. They had yet to clash, but the breezy plains alliance was already caught off guard and incredibly frightened. If the Gilded Kingdom showed some hostility at this time, many forces in the alliance would immediately succumb to them. They did not stop at the Levitan Canyon, and instead crossed over directly. Where will they go next? Seeing that the ambience in the conference hall was rather somber, Abrid wanted to divert the attention of the people for a while so that they could stop thinking about the seemingly glorious battle results of the Gilded Kingdom. However, Abrid's efforts were fruitless as everyone in the conference hall was a bit frightened by the strength of the Gilded Kingdom. They were all thinking about their own future, and no one cared about the final destination of the Gilded Kingdom's team at all, as it was no longer important to them. The important thing was that through the incident this time, they had finally found out how terrifying the strength of the Gilded Kingdom was. However, next to him, Rajet, who was also a sanctuary powerhouse, naturally snapped back to his senses rather quickly. After hearing Abrid's words, he naturally shifted his gaze onto the large map. It was actually not too difficult to determine the destination of the Gilded Kingdom team now, since 2 points could form a line. The Blackwater Swamp and Levitan's Canyons were like 2 points that formed an arrow to point out the direction of the army. As long as they searched in that direction, they would roughly know where their target destination was. Rajet's gaze slowly moved around the map as he secretly made some analysis in his heart while looking at it, deducing which places would be worthless and which ones would be valuable but unworthy of the Gilded Kingdom's efforts. Finally, he stopped and fixed his gaze on an inconspicuous corner of the map. At this moment, Elvis and Abrid also noticed Rajet's behavior. Initially, Abrid just made that casual remark because he wanted to divert everyone's attention. To his surprise, Rajet really tried to find it, and he seemed to have done it. Hence, the two of them followed Rajet's gaze and looked at the map with curiosity. However, when they saw the map, they looked even more bewildered than before. They couldn't help but say, "That's impossible. Could it really be that place?" The behavior of the 3 sanctuary powerhouses finally caught the attention of the leaders of the various factions. They finally remembered where they were. They still had the support of 3 sanctuary powerhouses, and thus might not necessarily be weaker than the Gilded Kingdom's army. Of course, since they had yet to enter the sanctuary realm, they wouldn't know the difference between pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses and genuine sanctuary powerhouses. Besides, Elvis and the other 2 did not mention to anyone their trip to Port Tim. Hence, they naturally wouldn't know that those 3 sanctuary powerhouses, who were close to gods in their eyes, had been completely embarrassed by the Gilded Kingdom. Thus, the crowd finally put aside their own thoughts for a while and turned their attention to the 3 sanctuary powerhouses in a bid to find out what they had discovered. They wondered if the Gilded Kingdom had made some unexpected move. When they looked at the 3 sanctuary powerhouses, they saw Elvis pointing at a certain location on the map. "Isn't that Cage Island?" said someone who was familiar with the map. His tone was full of bewilderment too. Cage Island. The majority of people present were not familiar with that place, but they were all aware of its existence because, in their opinion, it was a boring and unpopular place. Although it was unlike the Blackwater Swamp and Levitan Canyon, which were known to be deadly places in the breezy plains, it was definitely not a tourist attraction. Cage Island was located in the center of a crescent-shaped bay, at the southernmost end of the breezy plains. It was surrounded by various cliffs, and the gap that led to the sea was covered with islands of varying sizes. It was just like a natural labyrinth, which no large ship could pass through to enter the bay. Cage Island, which was located in the center of the bay, had existed since before the Dark Age. It was called Cage Island because legend had it that there was once an ancient wyrm imprisoned there by a titan. Of course, it was just a legend. In fact, it was not that no one had ever set foot on the island. However, rumor had it that other than a plot of barren land, there was no trace of an ancient wyrm or titan. However, disregarding the fact that the place did not fit the description in the legend, it did give off a peculiar vibe. Cage Island had a large surface area, but it was barren and frightening. There was not a single tree, or blade of grass in sight, let alone any animals or magical beasts. The peculiar thing was that any creature that stepped into the range of the island would react like they had been put under a strange curse, as their vitality would deplete rapidly. Creatures with weaker vitality could probably not even survive 3 days on the island. Even powerhouses that were level 15 and above, and had a greater vitality than ordinary people, would last at most 10 days. Of course, the vitality of legendary powerhouses was stronger, and perhaps they might last longer in such a peculiar environment. However, no one had ever heard of a legendary powerhouse who was mindless and bored enough to go to that lone and barren island to challenge the limits of survival. After the Dark Age, people rarely mentioned that place because there was really nothing much to say about it. There were no animals, plants, or any valuable resources. Besides, with such a bizarre environment that would put one under a curse, Cage Island almost became a forgotten land in the breezy plains. Hence, when the name Cage Island was mentioned, many people in the conference hall were at a loss, and they only found the name a little familiar. However, they did not have much of an impression of it. It was only after someone reminded them that the crowd slowly remembered that such an unpopular place existed in the breezy plains. Of course, after knowing that the destination of the Gilded Kingdom's team was Cage Island, the crowd felt even more puzzled. Judging from the behavior of the Gilded Kingdom after entering the breezy plains, it seemed that the Gilded Kingdom needed the various resources of the breezy plains very much. If the Gilded Kingdom's army was so poor that they had to find some minerals in the wilderness, it would be quite reasonable. However, they could not think of anything valuable in a deserted place like Cage Island. Hence, although the crowd did not say much about the conjecture that Elvis and the others came up with, their attitude showed their obvious apprehension. After all, the people of the Gilded Kingdom were not fools. Why would they go to that place for nothing? However, as pieces of news were delivered one after another, Elvis and the others' conjecture was gradually proven to be true. The direction of the Gilded Kingdom's army was very clear. They were heading all the way straight to Cage Island. Along the way, they even encountered some new resource deposits, but they did not stop at all. The strange behavior of the Gilded Kingdom had confused the people of the breezy plains, and they wondered if there was really something on Cage Island that attracted them. However, as the goal of the Gilded Kingdom's army became clearer, what they dreaded the most did not happen. The people in the breezy plains could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As the latest piece of news was delivered, the Gilded Kingdom's army had started to embark on their route to the island. Someone from the Alliance finally proposed to return to their own territories. The fact that the Gilded Kingdom's team had gone on the island meant that the threat in this incident had vanished. In the opinion of the leaders of the various forces of the Alliance, there was naturally nothing left to discuss. Although the conference of the Alliance had ended, the various forces did not pay any less attention to the Gilded Kingdom. After all, they were very curious about what the Gilded Kingdom's army was doing on Cage Island, and whether there were really any precious resources, or even treasures hidden on that barren island. Of course, most of them were still waiting to see the Gilded Kingdom make themselves a laughingstock. If there had really been something great on Cage Island, it would have probably already been discovered by others long ago. How could the Gilded Kingdom get anything? However, no one expected that as the Gilded Kingdom's team got on the island, things began to develop beyond their expectations. After the Gilded Kingdom's team embarked on their journey on the island, more than 10 legendary mages in the team immediately began to set up a huge alchemy array there. Immediately afterwards, they each stood at a different position on the island, raised the staffs in their hands, and chanted an ancient and mysterious incantation loudly. With the movement of those legendary mages, the alchemy array on Cage Island gradually began to light up. The light gradually became lighter, and even became close to engulfing Cage Island as if it had become a sun floating on the surface of the sea. However, when the light of the alchemy array reached its brightest, thick gray clouds suddenly appeared in the sky that was originally turquoise in color. They rolled continuously as if they were going to press against the top of their heads. The clouds were also filled with snake-like arcs of lightning, and thunder rumbled. At the same time, the sea around Cage Island seemed to have started boiling as it roared and tumbled while the waves soared high to a height of tens of meters. However, no matter how tall the waves were, they could not touch the island, and it was as if there was an invisible layer of protection outside the island. However, the island was also shaking vigorously, as if it was a boat that would capsize amidst the storm. The 10-odd legendary mages that were guarding the alchemy array were doing their best to keep it running. However, they had no idea what kind of power would cause the alchemy array to emit a flickering light. The operation was clearly not smooth. The scouts sent by the various forces of the breezy plains watched the dramatic changes on Cage Island from afar. only to be stunned by the earth-shattering scene. They did not know that they would see such a violent sight on the barren island. Immediately afterwards, a low but penetrative roar of a dragon suddenly surged from the depths of the sea. Amidst the roar of the gigantic waves, the dragon's roar seemed exceptionally clear and distinctive. The area around Cage Island seemed to have changed drastically too, as the thick dark clouds in the sky seemed to reveal a dark red hue, as if blood clots were forming. The sea around Cage Island was eventually dyed as black as ink, and numerous gigantic waves surged, resembling a moving black mountain range. The surface area was so massive that it seemed to be connected to the sky. The waves rolled and crashed against the sea, emitting a deafening rumble. However, that was only the beginning, and the scouts soon saw the lightning that was flickering and bouncing around the clouds in the sky suddenly converge like it had received some command. In the blink of an eye, the sky above Cage Island turned into a sanguine pool of lightning. Before the people of the Gilded Kingdom could react, a sanguine thunderbolt that emitted a bloody odor had already come blasting down from the sky. Cage Island was being bombarded by an intense wave of attacks, and the numerous sanguine thunderbolts seemed to cause the entire island to shake vigorously as they blasted the bodies of the legendary mages, causing them to turn into ashes. The magical shields of the legendary mages seemed to have become as fragile as paper in the face of the sanguine thunderbolts. They could not even buy the legendary mages a tenth of a second. Seeing that the sanguine thunderbolts were continuously crashing down and had annihilated half of the legendary mages in their own team, in the blink of an eye, the sanctuary powerhouse of the Gilded Kingdom finally took action. Of course, the scouts who had been spying from afar did not know that it was a sanctuary powerhouse. The leaders of the various forces only discovered that there was actually a sanctuary powerhouse involved in this operation of the Gilded Kingdom when they received all the information. The sanctuary powerhouse who participated in the Gilded Kingdom's operation this time was none other than Elder Zoomer, who ranked fourth among the 10 elders of the Illuminati, and was one of the patriarchs who followed the priest to the Gilded Kingdom to spread and preach the Illuminatist doctrine. Hence, his status among the Illuminati was far above Elder Jor's. That was also why Cantori, Elder Jory, and the others would personally greet and receive him when the fleet entered the harbor. The domain world that Elder Zoomer cast out was a world that seemed like an ocean where there was a turquoise sky, a boundless sea, and an endless number of sea beasts that were of various forms. The ocean world engulfed Cage Island as soon as it appeared, and the people of the Gilded Kingdom were pulled into the domain world, where they were protected by the sanctuary powerhouse. Of course, just like the real ocean, the world of this domain was not calm and peaceful at all. When the sanguine thunderbolts outside continuously blasted into the oceanic world, it began getting riled up too as it set off a huge storm against the invading forces. However, even Elder Zoomer's domain world could not subdue and take in Cage Island. As the oceanic world and Cage Island were separated by an invisible force, it was as if there were some supreme world laws that were impossible to break even for a sanctuary powerhouse who understood the world laws. The sanguine thunderbolts blasted the oceanic world continuously while gigantic black waves surged around Cage Island, crashing against the oceanic world. From afar, one could see that the oceanic world was clearly becoming distorted amidst the bombardment, as if it was a bubble that was continuously getting compressed vigorously by an immense force. It seemed to be on the verge of shattering loudly any moment. Elder Zoomer, who was in the middle of the oceanic world, had a somber and grave expression on his face. The external attack on his domain world had already left him with no choice but to go all out and use his full strength to maintain the stability of the domain world. The news of battle on Cage Island was quickly spread inland by the scouts through various means, thus immediately attracting the attention of the various forces of the breezy plains. What really surprised them was the fact that the Gilded Kingdom had a sanctuary powerhouse involved in this operation. What exactly was hidden on Cage Island that would be worthy of the involvement of a sanctuary powerhouse? Of course, a more surprising thing was that it seemed that the sanctuary powerhouse from the Gilded Kingdom had not been able to make any fruitful moves on Cage Island either. Hence, the forces unanimously sent more scouts to Cage Island in hopes of finding out what the Gilded Kingdom was trying to do and what secrets were hidden on the island which had been forgotten for thousands of years. Fortunately, the Gilded Kingdom's team had already cleared a safe passage straight to Cage Island, so the additional spies sent by the various forces managed to arrive at the site rather quickly. For a while, the number of scouts around Cage Island surpassed 1,000. They were no longer snooping around secretly. Instead, they each got into a good position and watched the great battle on Cage Island openly. It was as if they were there to watch a show. However, the Gilded Kingdom did not have the energy to pay attention to the actions of the scouts. Although Elder Zoomer had blocked most of the attacks, it seemed unlikely for him to have the time to do anything else. As for the legendary mages, who were lucky to have survived, as well as the warriors in the team, they were protected in the oceanic world, and could not leave for the time being. Just like that, the scouts of the factions from the breezy plains watched as the Gilded Kingdom's sanctuary powerhouse and the mysterious power of Cage Island remained in a stalemate. They ended up watching for nearly 10 successive days, and they even began to get a little bored. However, a wave of dense and violent roars suddenly began coming from above the sea on the 10th day. Before the scouts could go to investigate the situation, they saw a fleet of a dozen giant battleships sailing rapidly towards Cage Island. Needless to say, only the Gilded Kingdom could afford to have such a fleet in Anral. After the huge fleet arrived, it immediately got into a battle formation and surrounded Cage Island. Although the sea around Cage Island was frightening under the influence of that mysterious power, the giant battleships of the Gilded Kingdom did not seem to have been affected much. They stopped steadily as if they had existed at that spot for thousands of years. Since they had been having the sea beasts as their main opponents, the gun laying of the cannons on their battleships was very flexible, and they could easily fire below the surface of the sea. After setting up the formation, the people on the battleships quickly adjusted the firing angles of the cannons, aiming them at the bottom of Cage Island. The cannons used on the Gilded Kingdom's battleships were somewhat similar to the magical crystal cannons produced by the Dwarf Kingdom, which were also powered by magical crystals, and would fire after compressing mana to the maximum. However, compared to most magical crystal cannons, the ones on these battleships were much larger, especially the main one, which had a caliber that could compare to that of 10 ordinary magical crystal cannons. Each cannon on the battleship would probably use up 1 legendary magical crystal per shot. That also had something to do with the environment in the Gilded Kingdom, which was situated in the endless sea, where there were all sorts of sea creatures, including giant sea beasts, that were even larger than the ancient worms. If the power of the magical crystals was reduced, it would not be enough to pose a threat to those sea beasts at all. Only a magical crystal cannons of such a massive size could allow the fleet of the Gilded Kingdom to dominate the seas. The consumption of 1 legendary magical crystal per cannon was definitely not something that any force could afford to support on Anral. The Leaden Kingdom and Felon Kingdom could not even bear to use ordinary magical crystals, let alone legendary magical crystals. However, in the Endless Sea, legendary level sea beasts were too rampant, though they were not too violent either. Hence, it wouldn't be too difficult to obtain legendary magical crystals. Of course, even the Gilded Kingdom had yet to reach the point where they did not take legendary magical crystals seriously. The main cannons on the battleship, which had a massive consumption of legendary magical crystals, would only be used when they encountered the threat of giant sea beasts. If they were to really use it to deal with smaller fishes, they would not be able to afford the consumption either. Clearly, they had already received instructions and were aiming the main cannons below Cage Island. Seeing the movement of the battleships, the scouts in the distance immediately began to breathe rapidly. As residents of the breezy plains, or rather Anral, they really had very few opportunities to witness such scenes. In fact, not to mention the scouts, even the people of the Gilded Kingdom also rarely had the opportunity to witness the scene of the whole fleet firing unanimously. In particular, even those who served on a battleship for a lifetime might never be able to witness the main cannons firing. Apart from the magical crystal cannons of various sizes, the battleship was often equipped with weapons such as a projectile weapon named the Poseidon Trident. It was a large weapon that would be easily recognized as a harpoon that many ships were often equipped with. However, the Gilded Kingdom's Poseidon Trident was too large. If it was fired at an ordinary merchant ship, the ship would probably be blown into pieces. Generally speaking, the magical crystal cannons were used against enemies, while the Poseidon Trident was used for hunting sea beasts. After all, many of the giant beasts in the ocean possessed strong vitality. Although the magical crystal cannons were sharp and lethal, they could only cause the sea beasts to get wounded and flee most of the time. The people on the fleet were ordered to attack at full power, hence, all the weapons were used, regardless of their purpose. After everything was ready, there were soon new orders for them to fire. In an instant, the thousands of magical crystal cannons on more than 10 vessels began emitting dazzling rays of light as the cannons shot at the spot below Cage Island. The dozens of Poseidon Tridents penetrated the waves and shuttled into the sea as if they were trying to overturn the entire Cage Island. Seeing this scene, almost everyone thought that Cage Island was going to follow in the footsteps of the Blackwater Swamp and completely disappear from Anral. However, after all the attacks stopped for the time being, the people were surprised to find that Cage Island did not seem to have undergone any changes. The only difference was that the sea around Cage Island began surging even more violently than before, causing massive waves to charge upwards and crash against the battleships. The massive battleships of the Gilded Kingdom were so large that they looked like floating islands. However, compared to the huge waves, the giant battleships seemed rather small, and each wave seemed to almost press them down to the bottom of the sea. Fortunately, alchemy was used in the battleships of the Gilded Kingdom, so almost no one had to work on the deck. Otherwise, they would have been wiped out. The fleet, which had been thrown into jeopardy by the huge waves, did not bother to adjust its formation, and immediately opened fire and attacked the bottom of Cage Island again. This time, they attacked continuously, and were even at the risk of overloading their cannons. This was a feast for the eyes of the scouts in the distance. At the same time, they were overwhelmed by the strength of the Gilded Kingdom's fleet. With such a terrifying power, it was no wonder that they would be said to dominate the endless ocean. Even the naval fleets of Leaden Kingdom and Felon Kingdom were destroyed. However, the stronger the Gilded Kingdom's fleet was, the more bizarre Cage Island looked. If it had been an ordinary island, the first salvo from the Gilded Kingdom's battleships would have been enough to destroy the island. However, Cage Island was still intact after being bombarded with the full force of the Gilded Kingdom's fleet for a long time. What exactly was hidden under Cage Island? Was there really a legendary ancient evil wyrm that had been imprisoned there? After receiving the information from the scouts, almost everyone became quite interested in Cage Island, which they originally did not bother to mention at all. Of course, they had the self-awareness to know that they were not fit to intervene in this matter. Even a force like the Gilded Kingdom, which had a powerful fleet and the sanctuary powerhouse, could not cause any substantial damage to Cage Island. Wouldn't they be courting death if they intervened? Hence, all they could do was to instruct their scouts to speed up the frequency of news transmission so that they could understand the situation of the battle on Cage Island as timely as possible. None of the leaders of the forces had the guts to take the risk seeing the situation for themselves. After all, there was no benefit to that, so who would do something that wouldn't be beneficial? As countless people watched Cage Island, changes occurred in the battle again. The situation was progressing in a direction that was extremely unfavorable to the Gilded Kingdom. A true sanctuary powerhouse and a fleet with impeccable combat power fell into an absolute disadvantage before they could even see their enemies. At this moment, Elder Zoomer's face had turned extremely sullen, and his domain world was on the verge of collapsing too. The battleships that surrounded Cage Island also seemed to have been wrecked, and were beyond pathetic. In fact, they could be said to be in a miserable state. 2 battleships have submerged to the extent that only the observation deck is still exposed on the surface, while another had already sailed away from the battle area with difficulty. The battleship was tilted, and had clearly been heavily damaged. As for the rest of the battleships, they were still persistently bombarding Cage Island, but each of them was severely damaged. Seeing such a situation, Elder Zoomer knew that there was no hope for this matter to be resolved using his own power. Hence, he summoned Cantori, who had arrived with the team while keeping up his domain world and suppressing the power of the mysterious existence below Cage Island. Elder Zoomer, Cantori exclaimed, behaving like an obedient child in front of Elder Zoomer. His unruly nature was not shown at all. Cantori, you have been in charge of the matters in the Breezy Plains, and you've had contact with the various forces of the Breezy Plains. Now, I want you to immediately go and contact those forces of the Breezy Plains and find a way to get them involved in this matter. Elder Zoomer quickly finished his sentence and waved his hand to send Cantori away from his domain world without waiting for his response. After hearing Elder Zoomer's words, Cantori understood that he wanted him to go and ask for help from the forces of the Breezy Plains. However, given how arrogant Cantori was, asking for help from others was simply a torture for him, not to mention requesting it from the forces of the Breezy Plains, which he looked down on in the first place. However, before Cantori could say anything, he felt an unstoppable force surging towards him, and he couldn't continue saying what he wanted to. By the time he got a clearer idea of the situation around him, he realized that he was in a place that he had passed by when he went to Cage Island. No matter how reluctant he was, he had no choice but to act according to Elder Zoomer's instructions. Which force do you belong to? Take me to your leader. Cantori decided to save himself the trouble and directly grabbed from the vicinity a scout, who then led him to the leader of the force he belonged to. The leader was none other than the patriarch of the Karsha family, Sandev. Sandev had previously been frightened by the Gilded Kingdom's group, thinking that the other party was trying to take revenge on his family. Although he discovered later that that had not been the case, there were changes in his heart. Ever since he returned from the Mithril Alliance, he had been thinking about how to get on the Gilded Kingdom's side and cozy up to them. Cantori's arrival was just what Sandev needed, as it was a perfect opportunity for him to cozy up to the Gilded Kingdom. In order to cozy up to the Gilded Kingdom, Sandev of the Karsha family naturally dared not delay in helping Cantori. He was even more hardworking than when he was handling his own matters. While serving Cantori like he was a prestigious guest, he sent out a large amount of manpower to contact the various forces of the Breezy Plains. In fact, the leaders of the forces could already tell from the news about Cantori being sent out by Zoomer, which was delivered by the scouts, that the Gilded Kingdom was probably having a hard time hanging on. After all, they all saw the state of the battle on Cage Island, and it was obvious that the Gilded Kingdom was overwhelmed and stuck in a spot. The leaders of the forces of the Breezy Plains were overjoyed to see the Gilded Kingdom in trouble. Why would they jeopardize it and do something that wasn't beneficial to them at all? They were not fools, and knew that the Gilded Kingdom's team had a real sanctuary powerhouse, yet they were still in such a terrible state. Even if there were treasures on Cage Island, they would probably die before they could enjoy them. However, they did not want their relationship with the Gilded Kingdom to become too stiff, as that wouldn't be beneficial to them either. Hence, after getting the news, they also sent some representatives to the Karsha family. Of course, before they set out, the representatives were instructed to just go over and go through the motions, and perhaps see how the arrogant members of the Gilded Kingdom swallowed their pride. Looking at the representatives of the forces with a sullen expression, Kantori wished he could rip them into pieces. They were speaking to him respectfully and giving him endless compliments, but when he got to the main topic, they immediately began patronizing him, causing the entire discussion to end up being just a waste of time. Given Kantori's usual temper, he would have long lost his temper in the past, but now he had to suppress the anger in his heart. Although he had always been arrogant, he had clear priorities and knew that it was not the time to cause trouble, since Elder Zoomer and the rest were still waiting for reinforcements on Cage Island. According to his usual way of handling matters, Kantori even tried to use some sophistry to convince the representatives of the forces at the beginning of the discussion. However, he soon came to his senses and realized that they were not in the Gilded Kingdom, but the Breezy Plains, where no one would be convinced by him. Hence, after realizing the truth, Kantori immediately began trying to tempt them with interests. Knowing that the forces of the Breezy Plains were driven by profits, he thought that they would give everything they had to help as long as he offered them enough. However, despite being full of greed, the representatives of the forces of the Breezy Plains did not agree to Kantori's offers this time. They were not fools. Even if the Gilded Kingdom offered them a massive benefit, they would have to be alive in order to enjoy it. Although they did not know about the situation on Cage Island, they could tell that it was not simple. Even the powerful Gilded Kingdom ended up in such a terrible state. If they intervened, they would only end up being cannon fodder, which would usually end up with nothing. Don't forget, Cage Island belongs to the Breezy Plains, not the Gilded Kingdom. If the things inside escape, the first to suffer will be the Breezy Plains. Seeing that the plan to tempt them had failed, Kantori tried to threaten them, which indeed made the representatives of the various forces below suddenly panic. During this period of time, the forces of the Breezy Plains had also searched everywhere for information related to the legend of the Cage Island. But in addition to the legend of the ancient dragon that had been imprisoned by a titan, there wasn't any other information that seemed reliable. Hence, no one except the people of the Gilded Kingdom knew what was below Cage Island. Hearing Kantori's threat, the people of the Breezy Plains dared not take it too lightly despite suspecting something. In the past, the Retribution Night ravaged the Breezy Plains and subjected it to a devastating disaster, which caused countless factions to disappear. The ones that were lucky to survive had also suffered major losses. Looking at the commotion caused by the Gilded Kingdom on Cage Island, they reckoned that there had to be something impressive in there. Even if it was not as impressive as Rodheart, it would definitely cause a bloodbath in the Breezy Plains. Of course, that was only one possibility. Another possibility could be that the Gilded Kingdom was just making an exaggeration to implicate the forces of the Breezy Plains. After all, even if these forces finally figured out what happened, they could not really do anything to the Gilded Kingdom. The news immediately made the representatives of the forces below talk to each other, which was to Kantori's relief. Although the benefits he offered were not enough to attract them, they probably would not refuse when their interests were concerned. However, while Kantori was waiting for the crowd to take a stand, Joseph, who represented the Mithril Alliance, suddenly said, "Envoy Kantori, I think we can't give you an answer immediately. Well, you should know that we have always been at the mercy of the Ashen Warlock Roland when it comes to making arrangements for the Breezy Plains. Now, President Fulik of the Tower of Ashes can be considered Lord Roland's spokesperson. Hence, we have to seek his opinion. As long as you can convince President Fulik, we won't have an opinion." Joseph did not want to fall out with the Gilded Kingdom or get involved in this matter. Hence, he thought of putting the blame on the Tower of Dusk. Of course, he was too embarrassed to tell Kantori that the forces had once submitted to the Tower of Dusk, and thus said that Lin Li was the spokesman of the Ashen Warlock. According to Joseph's idea, the entry of the Gilded Kingdom into the Breezy Plains had undoubtedly caused considerable damage to the interests of the Tower of Dusk. Although the two sides reached an agreement in the negotiations, everyone knew that two tigers couldn't share one mountain. Thus, it was only a matter of time before a war broke out between the two top forces. The Tower of Dusk would gloat over the Gilded Kingdom's predicament, and obviously wouldn't step forth to help. Not only could the other faction decline to help the Gilded Kingdom, they would not have to fall out with them, either. Such a perfect solution, where they could have the best of both worlds, had always been the favorite of the forces of the Breezy Plains. Hence, after hearing Joseph's words, the representatives of the other forces also immediately chimed in to support his idea. However, Kantori did not think so much. After all, when they had come to the Breezy Plains, they had gone to the Ashen Warlock, only to be told that they had to speak to President Flick of the Tower of Dusk regarding all the issues in the Breezy Plains. Hence, in their opinion, it would not be wrong to say that the president of the Tower of Dusk was the spokesman of the Ashen Warlock. However, what made Kantori feel troubled was the fact that he knew how difficult it was to deal with President Flick of the Tower of Dusk after the previous negotiations. Although the negotiations were finally settled, the process and outcome were unsatisfactory. Initially, Kantori had felt that he might never have to deal with the Tower of Dusk again, and perhaps the next time they met would be when the Gilded Kingdom took over the Breezy Plains. However, the people of the Breezy Plains actually told him now to talk to the damned Flick of the Tower of Dusk. Kantori immediately felt a headache coming on. At this time, Kantori even felt regretful for not enjoying life well in the Gilded Kingdom, and insisting on going to the Breezy Plains to suffer. However, it was too late for regrets now, and he knew that if he failed to handle this well, even his teacher wouldn't forgive him. He would also end up losing his status, glory, wealth, and so on. Glaring at the people who were seated nearby, Kantori knew that they were using the Tower of Dusk as a shield, and thus there was no longer any point in trying to tempt or threaten them. However, at the thought of his previous negotiation experience, he couldn't help but feel a headache. In the past, he had been extorted of all his kingdom's maritime information for the sake of entering the Breezy Plains. What price would he have to pay this time? To be frank, Kantori felt some fear towards the young president of the Tower of Dusk, which was a fact that might shock everyone. Kantori would rather stay on Cage Island than swallow his pride to beg the young president of the Tower of Dusk to help. However, Kantori no longer had a choice now. Not only did he have to face the damned Flick, he had to make sure that he got the matter done. In other words, no matter how Lin Li made things difficult for him, and how outrageous his requests were, he had to give in, even if Lin Li wanted to slap him. At this point, Kantori knew that there was no point in saying anything else to these forces. As long as he could convince Lin Li, they would have no more excuses. If he couldn't, they wouldn't agree even if he threatened them with a knife. Although he couldn't bring himself to do it, Kantori immediately left the crowd in the conference hall, and used the power of flight to fly towards the Tower of Dusk without delay. At the beginning, Kantori's flight speed was very fast, but when he saw the huge sky castle in the sky, or perhaps it was because he had been flying too fast, and hadn't thought about how to face Lin Li, the president of the Tower of Dusk, and how to persuade him to intervene, he slowed down. However, no matter how slow Kantori was, the journey could not be extended. He watched as the Tower of Dusk became larger in sight while the surrounding magic towers became clearer. However, he was incredibly confused, and was at a loss for what to do. While hesitating, Kantori flew close to the Tower of Dusk and descended at the gate of the Magic City. In the past, he would have just flown directly to the Tower of Dusk. Of course, he didn't do so now, not out of courtesy, but purely because he needed more time. There weren't any strict entry requirements at the Magic City of the Tower of Dusk, so Kantori, who was wearing a magic robe, had already reached the gate before he even realized it. At this moment, someone finally went forth to stop him and question him. After all, even the mages were not allowed to enter and leave the tower freely, let alone Kantori, an obvious outsider. Kantori, who had snapped out of his trance, subconsciously wanted to fly into a rage, but fortunately he reacted fast enough. As soon as he started glaring, he remembered where he was, and quickly put on a calmer expression. He said to the mage who came to question him, "I'm an envoy of the Gilded Kingdom, and I would like to see your president for something urgent." The envoy of the Gilded Kingdom. As soon as he heard Kantori report his identity, the expression of that mage from the Tower of Dusk immediately became sullen. In fact, many people, including some mages of the Tower of Dusk, felt that the Gilded Kingdom's entry to the Breezy Plains would affect the Tower of Dusk the most. Before the Gilded Kingdom arrived, the Tower of Dusk had reached a level where all the forces in the Breezy Plains had to stoop low and submit to them. However, once the Gilded Kingdom arrived, there were two authoritative forces that the factions had to subdue too. Besides, it was obvious that the Tower of Dusk and Gilded Kingdom would clash sooner or later. Therefore, in the view of the majority of people, the Tower of Dusk and the Gilded Kingdom were still at odds with each other. Even though they had reached a consensus for their negotiations, they had merely compromised with each other on the surface, so there just seemed to be less animosity and hostility between the two. Now that the enemy was standing right in front of him, the mage of the Tower of Dusk naturally wouldn't be nice to him. However, this mage didn't have a high status. Those in the Sky Castle who liked battles would probably have chased Kantori out. So you're an envoy of the Gilded Kingdom. Please wait here for a moment. I will go to report to our president. The mage did not lead Kantori to the guest hall, and instead left without him after bringing him to the main hall. Kantori had never been treated that way all his life. If not for what had happened on Cage Island, he would have probably turned around to leave angrily. However, he now had no choice but to hold his anger back and stay there. He even looked for a place to sit down in the hall. Besides, what made Kantori feel terrible was the vast number of people who were passing by in the hall. The mage did not speak softly just now, and almost everyone in the hall heard him. Hence, they were all looking at Kantori with a hostile expression. If Kantori had come because of other things, he would have definitely raised his chin high to express his disdain for them. However, he was there to request help from the president of the Tower of Dusk. To put it bluntly, he was there to plead with Lin Li. Although the mages should not know this, he had a guilty conscience and felt that they were aware. After a period of time, which Kantori felt was centuries long, the mage who had received him finally came out and brought him to a meeting room. Without those intense gazes, Kantori finally felt better. However, when he thought about how he was going to face someone who was much harder to deal with, and even had to ask him for help, he immediately felt that his disaster had just begun. I heard that the Gilded Kingdom has recently launched a huge operation on Cage Island. How can you have the time to visit our tiny force, envoy Kantori? When I heard the report from the people downstairs just now, I thought that someone was assuming your identity. My apologies, said Lin Li, who didn't deliberately make Kantori wait longer. At his current level, he wouldn't bother doing something so petty. Although Kantori was there to ask for help, he had never begged all his life. Others were always the ones to beg him. Even if he wanted to beg, he couldn't seem the part so easily. Seeing Lin Li enter the guest hall, Kantori sat still and disdainfully said, "It's really hard to see you, President Flick. Is this how the Tower of Dusk treats its guests?" Although it might not be considered hard for others, Kantori obviously thought differently. Given his status in the Gilded Kingdom, the people he wanted to see would be waiting for him way before he arrived. Almost no one would dare to make him wait. However, at the Tower of Dusk today, he was first made to wait outside in the hall where everyone cast peculiar gazes at him, and then, when he reached the guest hall, no one came to receive or entertain him. Kantori was long infuriated. He didn't forget what his agenda was, though. Otherwise, he would have long stomped off in a fury. Of course, Kantori was not just venting his frustration and displeasure, but rather wanted to pave the foundation for their conversation. Simply put, if he took control of the flow earlier, he wouldn't be in a passive position when requesting help later. Lin Li smiled faintly and didn't care about Kantori's complaint. Instead, he walked towards a seat and sat down. "Envoy Kantori, you and I both know what the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and the Gilded Kingdom is. Besides, we have our own way of hosting guests, and it varies depending on the guest. Okay, just cut straight to the chase. Surely you didn't come here to declare war this time, did you?" Kantori originally wanted to wait for Lin Li to apologize so that he could start talking about the matter of Cage Island, but he did not expect Lin Li to answer so bluntly. Besides, those words reminded him of the previous negotiation he had with Lin Li when his fleet was attacked. What's the relationship between the Gilded Kingdom and the Tower of Dusk? We're enemies, of course. Thinking about the pressing issue at hand, Kantori's heart sank. Asking one's enemy for help was probably the greatest joke ever. Kantori felt that if he was in Lin Li's place, he definitely wouldn't help his enemy either. He would even kick him down further and leave him with no means of survival. As he thought about it, Kantori subconsciously broke out in a cold sweat and even hesitated to tell Lin Li his agenda. If Lin Li chose not to help, and even added insult to his injury, the Gilded Kingdom's dream of dominating the breezy plains would burst like a bubble. "Envoy Kantori, the Tower of Dusk may be small, but we have a lot to handle every day. If you're really here just to be a guest, I'll get someone to take you around. I won't entertain you longer then," Lin Li said, not standing on ceremony after seeing how hesitant Kantori was. He stood up and got ready to leave. President Flick, please wait a moment," Kantori said as he frantically stood up. Despite feeling infuriated, he put on a sincere expression and said, "President Flick, I'm here this time for a very important matter. I was appointed by Elder Zoomer of the Illuminati, and I hope to cooperate with you in the matter on Cage Island, President Flick." Kantori also figured out that there was no one in the entire breezy plains who didn't know about the disaster on Cage Island. If the Tower of Dusk had really wanted to kick them while they were down, they would have done so long ago. However, he did not directly ask for help, and instead said that he was interested in a cooperation with the Tower of Dusk. If he requested help, the Gilded Kingdom would definitely be in a vulnerable position, being tantamount to meat that was waiting to be sliced, and they would have to comply with the Tower of Dusk's requests. If it was a cooperation, the two parties would be of equal status. There would be no negotiation then. Now, if the Tower of Dusk demanded a high price, the Gilded Kingdom could bargain. Kantori's idea was good, but Lin Li was not the type to be taken advantage of easily. Hearing that Kantori wanted to cooperate, Lin Li immediately stood up and shook his head smilingly. I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in Cage Island, so there's no need to say anything about cooperation. Wait, President Flick, if you have any conditions, we can talk things over slowly. Kantori panicked a little. If the Tower of Dusk was just the Tower of Dusk, he wouldn't have to be too nervous. The problem was that the other forces in the breezy plains were all acting according to the Tower of Dusk's decision. If he could not persuade the president of the Tower of Dusk, the Gilded Kingdom might really not get any help in the breezy plains. Envoy Kantori, this is not a matter of conditions. Cage Island is not included in the Tower of Dusk's development plan, so no matter what you've discovered on Cage Island, the Tower of Dusk would not be interested in intervening. So don't worry, Lin Li said righteously, making Kantori feel like he was facing an immovable mountain. Hearing Lin Li's words, Kantori felt like crying. Previously, the leaders of the Gilded Kingdom had not announced the purpose of this operation to the outside world, because they were worried that other forces would covet the secret treasures of Cage Island. However, he really wished that they would be interested in Cage Island, now so that he wouldn't have to swallow his pride and ask for help. President Flick, I reckon you should also know very clearly about the matter on Cage Island. I admit that the development of the situation has indeed exceeded our expectations, and the only thing we can do now is let Elder Zoomer temporarily suppress the existence below Cage Island. However, we can't suppress it entirely. In a moment of helplessness and desperation, Kantori had no choice but to admit that the group from the Gilded Kingdom had indeed encountered a tough problem on Cage Island. Oh, in this case, Envoy Kantori, you should be returning to the Gilded Kingdom now to ask for help immediately. Why do you still have the time to come to this Tower of Dusk to be my guest? Lin Li was not intentionally trying to mock him. It was just that Lin Li wouldn't take the initiative to offer help if Kantori didn't state things clearly. Lin Li's words caused a look of embarrassment to appear on Kantori's face, and he had a hard time suppressing the anger in his heart. A moment later, he said, President Flick, you can probably imagine how big a disaster it would be for the entire breezy plains if that horrible and terrifying existence under Cage Island really escaped. Although the Gilded Kingdom is far away, Elder Zoomer can't bear to see the beings in the breezy plains suffering and dying. Hence, he sent me to contact the various forces, in hopes that we can join forces to suppress the thing again before it breaks free. Kantori rephrased his words, but in fact, he still made it sound like a cooperation, except that the purpose of cooperation was not for any profits, but to protect the safety of the breezy plains. Besides, he even specially pointed out that the Gilded Kingdom was located overseas. If things were to really spiral out of control, he could at most just leave. However, where could the forces of the breezy plains, including the Tower of Dusk, flee? However, after hearing his words, Lin Li glanced at Kantori and calmly said, you people were the ones who caused this to happen, so naturally you have to be responsible. If you don't wish to take responsibility, you can move out of the breezy plains. Whatever happens in the future will no longer have anything to do with you. Profits were the biggest motivation. Lin Li did not believe that the Gilded Kingdom's forces would come to the breezy plains just for the sake of helping them solve a crisis. During the negotiation previously, Lin Li had already discovered that the breezy plains was of vital use to the Gilded Kingdom, and Cage Island should only be one of their agendas. Although he couldn't know the details, Lin Li could tell that no matter what the reason was, the Gilded Kingdom definitely wouldn't withdraw easily like what Kantori had mentioned, since they had already entered. Offering benefits didn't work, and neither did playing the justice card. Did he really have to put his pride aside and beg? Looking at Lin Li, who refused to give in, Kantori was infuriated, but he could only comfort himself by telling himself that he would settle scores with the Tower of Dusk in the future. President Flick, we are not trying to shirk our responsibility, but this matter is beyond our current capabilities. The Gilded Kingdom is far away in the sea, but we can't get any help from there for now. Hence, I'm here this time because I hope to get your help. Out of desperation, Kantori had no choice but to muster the courage and swallow his pride to reveal his true agenda. However, after saying this, Kantori did not feel any less worried. Instead, he panicked even more, as if he was waiting for the last verdict, as he stared at Lin Li's face. He had tried to tempt Lin Li with interests and played the justice card, but Lin Li refused to give him a nod of approval. Now, he lacked even more confidence. Oh, I see. You could have just stated from the beginning that you need help. Lin Li looked like he had come to a sudden realization. He nodded slightly and said, all right, since you really need help, I'll accompany you to Cage Island. How can it be like this? It doesn't make sense. Kantori yelled inwardly. He even felt a little dizzy as he couldn't believe his ears at all. After saying so much, he still didn't get Lin Li's nod of approval, yet now it came unexpectedly. Did he just agree to help so quickly? Could it be that this president of the Tower of Dusk is really a kind-hearted person who likes to help others? However, after snapping out of his shock, Kantori also immediately figured out that Lin Li was not helping others out of kindness, but was simply trying to give himself more reason to bargain for more during the negotiation later. During a cooperation, they would have an equal status. However, by asking for help, Kantori would clearly be putting himself and the Gilded Kingdom in a position that was lower than the Tower of Dusk's. Although the party that was requesting for help could not give everything the other party wanted, he had no rights to bargain. At this moment, Lin Li did not mention any conditions to Kantori. Instead, he reached his hand out into the air to open up a deep spatial rift. Seeing that Lin Li had casually formed a spatial rift in the air, Kantori was immediately dumbfounded. Even though he only had legendary strength, he had naturally interacted with genuine sanctuary powerhouses before since he was a disciple of the Illuminati. Initially, he always thought that Lin Li, the incredibly young sanctuary powerhouse, definitely relied on the magic tides to become a pseudo-sanctuary powerhouse, just like Elvis of the Mithril Alliance and the others. Although a pseudo-sanctuary powerhouse was also a sanctuary powerhouse, the former was far inferior, and they might never progress any further in the future. That was the very reason that Kantori, who had already reached the peak of the legendary realm, did not take the chance to break through to the sanctuary realm. At the same time, that was also the reason that Kantori did not take Lin Li, the sanctuary powerhouse who was about his age, too seriously. In his opinion, he himself might be weaker than pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses, but he would definitely surpass them in the future. However, an unbelievable conjecture immediately popped up in Kantori's mind when he saw Lin Li casually cutting out a spatial rift in the air. He remembered that his teacher once said that among all the laws, the space laws might not be the most difficult to comprehend, but they were definitely the most difficult to master. In order to fully master the space laws, the most basic and important ability one had to have was that of creating his own domain world. That was also something that even genuine sanctuary powerhouses might not be able to do. Impossible, he's so young. How can he step into the sanctuary realm? Based on his talent, Kantori was known to be a genius in the Gilded Kingdom, where he was called the best among the younger generation. Even his teacher, the priest of the Illuminati, had sung high praises for his talent. He had always believed that even in Anral, he was definitely the most talented. Hence, he definitely didn't believe that there would actually be someone who was even more talented than him, in such a barbaric and backward place like Anral. Is that some kind of magical equipment? After some careful search, Kantori suddenly realized that the magic robe that Lin Li was wearing was emitting an obscure fluctuation of space laws. That discovery made his eyes light up. I knew it. How can someone in his early 20s master the power that even ordinary sanctuary powerhouses can't master? That magic robe must be the reason. Indeed, Fulik has even obtained the Sky Castle. He might just have been able to get some precious magical equipment from in there. At the thought of this, Kantori finally regained some confidence in his own talent. At the same time, he had even greater disdain for Lin Li's decision to open the spatial rift in the sky. In his opinion, Lin Li's purpose in doing so was obviously to show off his strength, but he felt that there was nothing to show off, because he relied on magical equipment. Envoy Kantori, are you ready to go? Lin Li stood in front of the spatial rift, and turned to face Kantori, whose face was gradually becoming more radiant. Yes, we can set off any time. He regained his confidence proudly, and immediately felt much more relieved. He vaguely seemed to be raising his chin again. Kantori's change made Lin Li feel a bit puzzled, but he did not take it to heart, and instead directly stepped into the spatial rift. Although Kantori looked hesitant, he nonetheless bit the bullet and entered. When he stepped out of the spatial rift, Kantori found himself in the tiny Rafa city, where the Karsha family was. It was also the same place where he met with the representatives of the forces of the breezy plains. After some calculation, Kantori knew that it only took him a few minutes to get to that place from the Tower of Dusk, through the spatial rift. However, he had already determined that it was the power of that magic robe that allowed Lin Li to do it. Although the incredible moving speed was indeed amazing, Kantori didn't feel too shocked. He didn't even turn around to look at the spatial rift that was gradually closing. Smiling smugly as usual, he walked towards Lin Li and said, President Felix. The representatives of the various forces of the breezy plains are now in Rafa City. Let's discuss the matter of Cage Island together. In the conference hall of the Karsha family in Rafa City, the representatives who were already ready to return to their respective forces headed back to the hall in disbelief after receiving the news. To them, the news was rather unexpected because everyone knew that the Tower of Dusk and the Gilded Kingdom were in a hostile relationship. So would the conscientious president of the Tower of Dusk really help the Tower of Dusk's team? After the representatives of the various forces were seated in the conference hall, Lin Li entered under Kantori's lead. After Lin Li appeared, the conference hall, which was still a bit noisy, suddenly fell silent. Almost everyone was surprised, and their jaws dropped as their bodies stiffened like clay statues. They watched as Lin Li slowly moved over. Seriously, that Kantori actually managed to invite President Felix here. Haven't they always shared a hostile relationship? In the opinion of the representatives of the various forces, the Tower of Dusk was probably the force that was the least likely to help the Gilded Kingdom in the Breezy Plains. The entry of the Gilded Kingdom into the Breezy Plains had obviously affected the position of the Tower of Dusk. During the previous negotiations, the Tower of Dusk had also attacked the battleships of the Gilded Kingdom, and even revealed that they were at odds with each other. Although the negotiations ended successfully, everyone knew that the peace was only temporary. Soon, there would definitely be a conflict between the two forces again. That was also the reason that they decided to use the Tower of Dusk as a shield when they were being coerced by Kantori. They even said that they would follow the Tower of Dusk's decisions. They had originally thought that with the relationship between the Tower of Dusk and the Gilded Kingdom, the Tower of Dusk would definitely not agree to help the Gilded Kingdom. Then, they would have an appropriate excuse to stay out of the matter. However, they had not expected to see President Felix of the Tower of Dusk there. Besides, it did not look like he had come to make things worse for the Gilded Kingdom. That was completely beyond their previous expectations. This time, if the Tower of Dusk's president agreed to Kantori's request, they would no longer have a reason to refute, unless they went all out to fall out with the Gilded Kingdom. Everyone watched as Lin Li walked towards the middle of the conference hall without showing any intentions to discuss with them. He straightaway said, "All right, there is nothing much to talk about now. Relay the news and inform the leaders of your forces to make a trip here." Lin Li's words caused their hopes to be completely dashed. Everyone knew that Lin Li was referring to the hidden powerhouses, like Elvis and the others. They didn't think that the young president of the Tower of Dusk would want the hidden powerhouses of those forces to come here just for a chat. After saying that, Lin Li didn't say anything more, and instead turned around to leave the conference hall. When he finally vanished from their sight, everyone immediately got into an uproar and began discussing Lin Li's appearance. They couldn't understand how the arrogant Kantori managed to convince the Tower of Dusk's president to intervene despite their hostile relationship. However, regardless of whether they could figure it out or not, none of these people dared to take Lin Li's words lightly. After all, they didn't know what would happen if they offended the Gilded Kingdom, but they were well aware of what would happen if they offended the Tower of Dusk. The reason that they agreed to the Gilded Kingdom's request for help was most likely because of interests. Perhaps the Gilded Kingdom held some secrets about Cage Island, and maybe there was really something wonderful there. After the fruitless discussion, they did not dare to delay any longer. After all, they were only the representatives of their respective forces, so they could not really decide on this matter. Hence, after leaving the conference hall, they immediately relayed the news to the leaders of their respective forces through various means. Looking at the empty conference hall, Kantori was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions, partly because he had completed the task that Elder Zoomer gave him, and found some help for the Gilded Kingdom, and he felt relieved and overjoyed. On the other hand, he could also tell from the scene just now that the young president of the Tower of Dusk commanded a lot of authority in the Breezy Plains, so he was rather jealous and resentful. As the esteemed envoy of the Gilded Kingdom, and the proud disciple of the Illuminati, he actually had less influence than the leader of a minor local force. That made Kantori feel incredibly upset. At the same time, he had also gotten a clear understanding that the Tower of Dusk was going to be an obstacle to the Gilded Kingdom's development in the Breezy Plains, and one that could not be overcome. However, Kantori was not very worried about that problem, because he was already certain that the young president of the Tower of Dusk was only a pseudo-sanctuary powerhouse. In his opinion, as long as Elder Zoomer intervened, it would be a piece of cake for them to deal with a sanctuary powerhouse who had relied on external forces to enter the sanctuary realm. In less than half a day's time, the hidden forces who had received the news rushed to the small Rafa city without delay. They were not like Kantori, who thought that Lin Li was just a pseudo-sanctuary powerhouse. They could not say that they were very clear about Lin Li's true power, but they definitely had first-hand experience with it. Those people were pseudo-sanctuary powerhouses themselves, and they naturally had a more realistic perception of Lin Li's strength. They could completely feel the huge gap between Lin Li's strength and their own. However, regardless of whether they knew what Cantori was thinking, no one would remind him. The first to see Lin Li were Elvis, Abrid, and Rajet, the three sanctuary powerhouses. After bowing to Lin Li, the first question Elvis asked was exactly what everyone was doubting, and that was why Lin Li had agreed to Cantori's request. Even after entering the sanctuary realm, Elvis still found Lin Li's decision to be incredible. Could it be that sanctuary powerhouses just found joy in helping others? Masterful. The Gilded Kingdom did not communicate with any of us beforehand regarding this matter of Cage Island. Why did you still agree to come and help them? Wouldn't it be better to let them die on Cage Island? Elvis exclaimed, filled with anger at the thought of what the Gilded Kingdom had done to them at Port Tim. How could he be willing to help the Gilded Kingdom? In Elvis' opinion, it would be much better to destroy the forces of the Gilded Kingdom directly this time. With the power of that team, it would definitely be a huge loss for them even if the Gilded Kingdom was wealthy. That would also let the arrogant people of the Gilded Kingdom know that the Breezy Plains was not a place where they could do whatever they wanted. However, Lin Li smiled slightly, shook his head, and said, actually, you guys have to thank the Gilded Kingdom for this matter. If they hadn't triggered the changes in Cage Island in advance, you guys probably wouldn't have known what's hidden there. Lin Li's words made Elvis and the others perk up immediately as they unanimously thought, indeed, he won't do anything that doesn't bring profit. He obviously knows the secrets that are hidden on Cage Island. Although Elvis and others were not genuine sanctuary powerhouses, they had stepped into the sanctuary realm after all, and so they had a good understanding of the mindset of real sanctuary powerhouses.
Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share, and subscribe. Have a great day.